The day Margaret Hale won the baking competition, she didn't just beat the most powerful woman in Dry Ridge. She started a war that would nearly destroy everything she loved. Some stories are about survival. Others are about love. This one? This one's about a woman who refused to be small in a world that demanded she disappear, a place where your size determined your worth, and difference was a death sentence. What happens when the outsider stops apologizing? When the cook becomes the queen? When a single act of defiance burns down an entire social order? Stay with me until the end. Drop a comment with your city so I can see how far Margaret's story travels. Hit that like button if you believe courage can rewrite the rules. This is the story of the woman who refused to shrink. The stagecoach lurched to a stop, and Margaret Hale tasted dust before her boots hit the ground. Dry Ridge, Colorado Territory. Summer, 1877. The town looked like every other god-forsaken outpost she'd passed through. Wooden storefronts bleached gray by sun, a single church steeple stabbing at the sky, and dirt. Dirt everywhere, coating the windows, settling into the creases of men's faces, grinding between teeth with every meal. Margaret stepped down from the coach, her traveling dress straining across shoulders too broad for fashion, her carpet bag heavy with the few things she owned. The driver didn't offer assistance. He never did. Men stopped offering help somewhere around her 14th birthday, when she'd shot past 5.5 feet and kept climbing. "Silver Creek Ranch?" she asked. The driver jerked his chin toward the west. 5 miles. Road follows the creek bed. Walking distance. For some. His eyes traveled the length of her. Not with desire. Margaret had learned to recognize that particular poison. But with that other thing. Calculation. Categorization. The mental sorting that happened whenever she entered a room, a town, a life. Too tall. Too wide. Too much. She paid him, ignored his stare, and started walking. The sun hammered down. Sweat traced lines down her spine, soaked the cotton under her arms. Her thighs chafed where they rubbed together, but Margaret had learned to walk through pain the way other women walked through parlors, with her head up and her mouth shut. The ranch appeared gradually. First the fence line, then the barn, then the main house, a 2-story structure that had seen better decades. Cattle dotted the distant hills like scattered seeds. Closer in, she could see the bunkhouse, the smokehouse, a chicken coop that leaned drunk to one side. A man stood on the porch, tall, rangy, with the kind of stillness that spoke of hard decisions and harder consequences. His shirt was rolled to the elbows, dirt under his nails, face carved by weather into something between handsome and haunted. "Lucas Bennett?" Margaret called. "You're the cook." Not a question. She didn't bother answering it. "Margaret Hale. Your wire said the position included room and board. Bunkhouse is full. You'll take the room off the kitchen. It's small. Small is fine." Lucas Bennett studied her the way he might study a horse at auction, assessing value, looking for defects. Margaret was used to this too. She stood still and let him look. Let him see what everyone saw. A woman built like a farmhand with a face too plain for poetry and hands too rough for drawing rooms. "Pay is $20 a month," he said. "You cook 3 meals a day for 12 hands plus myself and my daughter. Washing up is included. Baking for the week happens Saturdays. You keep the kitchen clean, the pantry organized, and you don't waste food." "I don't waste anything, Mr. Bennett." Something flickered in his expression. Not quite a smile. "Range is temperamental. Takes an hour to heat proper. Well water's clean, but you have to prime the pump first thing. Hands eat at 6, noon, and 7. They're hungry, they're rough, and they don't give a damn about manners." "Neither do I." This time he did smile, brief as lightning. "You'll do then. Claire's inside. She'll show you the kitchen." He walked past her toward the barn, and Margaret climbed the porch steps. The house smelled like old coffee and older neglect, the particular scent of a place where men lived without women, where function had murdered comfort and left it in a shallow grave. "Hello?" she called. No answer. The kitchen was worse than she'd expected. Grease filmed every surface. The range was crusted with carbon. Dishes sat stacked in the dry sink, breeding God knew what in the cracks between plates. The floor felt sticky under her boots. Margaret set down her bag and rolled up her sleeves. A small sound made her turn. A girl stood in the doorway, maybe 9, maybe 10. thin as a fence post with brown hair that hung limp around a face that had forgotten how to be young. She wore a dress that had been pretty once, before the prairie had beaten the color out of it. "You're Clara," Margaret said. The girl nodded. "I'm Margaret. I'll be cooking here." Clara's eyes traveled over her, the same cataloging assessment Margaret had endured from every other person she'd met today. But there was something different in the child's gaze. Not judgment, something closer to recognition. "You're big," Clara said quietly. "I am." People must say mean things. Margaret crossed the kitchen, knelt down until she was eye level with the girl. Clara didn't flinch, but she didn't move closer either. "They do," Margaret said. "Do people say mean things to you?" "Sometimes." Clara's fingers twisted in her dress. "Mama died when I was 6. Now it's just Papa and me in the ranch. The town ladies say Papa should send me to boarding school back east, that I need a woman's influence." "What do you say?" Clara looked startled, as if no one had ever asked her opinion on her own life. "I want to stay here. This is my home." "Then that's what matters." Margaret stood, surveyed the wreckage of the kitchen again. She could work with this. She'd worked with worse. Kitchens in boarding houses where the rats outnumbered the residents, hotel galleys where the heat made strong men weep, private homes where the mistress watched her every move, waiting for failure. "I'll need hot water," she said. "Lots of it. Can you show me where the wood is?" Claire's face transformed. Not quite a smile, but something in the neighborhood of hope. "I can help? Good. Because this kitchen is going to be a battle, and I could use a soldier." They worked through the afternoon, heating water, scrubbing surfaces, sorting through the chaos. Clara didn't talk much, but she listened when Margaret explained what she was doing and why. The girl was smart, frighteningly so. She understood things the first time, remembered details, asked questions that cut straight to the center of a problem. "Why do you scrub with salt?" Clara asked, watching Margaret attack a particularly stubborn pan. "Salt's an abrasive, gets into the places soap can't reach, also draws out moisture, which helps prevent rust." "Mama used to cook," Clara said quietly, "before she got sick. Papa tried after, but everything tasted like shoe leather. Then we had Mrs. Patterson, but she left because the town ladies said it wasn't proper, her being here with just Papa. Then we had Mr. Chen, but he went to work the railroad. Then we had a lot of people," Margaret finished. "Yes." Claire's voice went smaller. "Are you going to leave too?" Margaret paused, her hands still in the wash water. The honest answer was probably yes. Everyone left eventually. Jobs ended, towns changed, people discovered they couldn't stomach her presence day after day. She'd learned not to put down roots because roots required earth that would hold them, and Margaret had never found soil that didn't eventually spit her out. But Clara was looking at her with those two old eyes, waiting for another abandonment, and Margaret found herself saying, "I don't plan to." The girl nodded, not quite believing, but wanting to. By the time the hands came in for supper, Margaret had performed a miracle. The kitchen wasn't clean, that would take days, but it was functional. She'd inventoried the pantry, assessed what she had to work with, and planned a meal that would fill empty bellies without wasting precious supplies. Salt pork and beans, cornbread, coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. The men filled the dining room like a flood, loud and rough, and smelling of cattle and sweat. They threw themselves into chairs, reached for bread before she'd finished setting it down, talked over each other with the casual violence of people who lived hard and expected to die the same way. Margaret served them without comment. She'd learned long ago that trying to impose order on hungry men was like trying to teach table manners to wolves. You gave them food, you stayed out of arm's reach, and you didn't take the crude jokes personally. "Well, hell," one of them said, looking at his plate. "It's actual food." "Told you Bennett finally found someone who could cook," another replied. "Didn't say nothing about her being—" "Shut up, Tommy," the first man cut in. He looked up at Margaret, touched the brim of his hat. "Thank you, ma'am. This is good." Margaret nodded and retreated to the kitchen, where Clara sat at the small work table, eating her own supper in silence. "Do they scare you?" the girl asked. "No, should they? They're big and loud." "So am I." Clara considered this. "Are you scared of anything?" Margaret thought about the truth. Yes. Hunger. Homelessness. The look in people's eyes when they decided she was too different to tolerate. The weight of her own body, the space she took up, the way the world seemed built for anyone but her. But she said, "Everyone's scared of something. The trick is not letting it make your decisions." Lucas Bennett came in after the hands had cleared out, carrying his empty plate. He set it in the dry sink, looked around the transformed kitchen, and nodded once. "You'll do," he said again. Then after a pause, "Clara talks to you." "Some. She doesn't talk much anymore. Not since her mother died." He rubbed the back of his neck, the gesture of a man carrying weight he couldn't set down. "The town thinks I should send her away, to school or to her aunt in Philadelphia. They say a girl needs refinement, culture, things a ranch can't provide." Margaret dried her hands on her apron, chose her words carefully. "What does Clara want?" "To stay here." "Then maybe that's your answer." Lucas's jaw tightened. "You don't know this town, the people in it. They have opinions about everything, and they're not shy about sharing them." "I've met towns before, Mr. Bennett. I've survived worse than opinions." He looked at her then, really looked, and Margaret saw the moment he understood. The moment he recognized another person who'd been measured by the world and found wanting. Another misfit. Another piece that didn't fit the puzzle everyone else seemed to solve so easily. "Lucas," he said, "if you're going to work here, you call me Lucas." "Margaret." "Margaret?" He tested the name, nodded. "The town will come after you. They already have opinions about the ranch, about me, about Clara. Adding you to the mix won't help." "I'm not here to help your reputation, Lucas. I'm here to cook." "Fair enough." He moved toward the door, paused. "But for what it's worth, I'm glad you're here." After he left, Margaret stood in the quiet kitchen and let herself feel something she hadn't felt in years. The dangerous, fragile thing called hope. The first Sunday, Margaret discovered church. Not by choice. Clara appeared in her doorway at dawn, wearing her best dress and a look of grim determination. "Papa says you should come to town," the girl announced. "For church. He says it's expected." Margaret, who had been planning to spend the day scrubbing the last of the grease from the kitchen ceiling, sighed. "I'm not particularly religious, Clara. Neither are half the people there, but everyone goes. It's where the town happens." The girl was right, of course. Margaret had lived enough places to know that church was rarely about faith. It was about being seen, about proving you belonged, about the social currency that bought tolerance. She put on her best dress, which wasn't saying much, and rode into town on the wagon beside Lucas and Clara. The church sat at the center of Dry Ridge like a moral anchor, its white paint peeling in the heat, its bell calling the faithful and the fraudulent alike. Margaret felt the stairs before she'd even climbed down from the wagon. Women in their Sunday best clustered like hens, their eyes sharp as they catalogued every detail of her appearance. The way her dress pulled across her shoulders. The way her bonnet sat slightly crooked because her head was too large for standard sizes. The way she moved, not gracefully, never gracefully, but with the solid competence of someone who'd learned early that grace was for people built differently. "That's her," someone whispered, not quietly enough. "The cook Bennett hired." "From where?" "Does it matter? Look at her." Margaret had learned to let the words slide past like water, to not give them purchase. But beside her, Clara's small hand found hers and squeezed. They entered the church. Lucas guided them to a pew near the back, not the family pew at the front where the Bennetts had once sat. Back when there was a Mrs. Bennett and the ranch's fortunes were different. People shifted to make room, but barely. Margaret took up more space than they wanted to give. The minister droned through a sermon about grace and redemption. Margaret watched the congregation instead. The elite sat at the front, the banker and his wife, the mayor, the owner of the general store. The middle classes filled the center, the workers and drifters scattered along the back and sides. And there, in the second pew, sat a woman who could only be Eleanor Whitmore. Margaret knew her on sight. Every town had an Eleanor Whitmore. The woman who set the social rules, who decided who belonged and who didn't, whose approval was currency and whose disfavor was exile. This Eleanor wore silk when everyone else wore cotton. Her hat was Eastern, her posture was perfect, and her eyes swept the congregation like a queen surveying her kingdom. Those eyes found Margaret, paused, assessed. Margaret stared back. Eleanor's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, a gauntlet, thrown. After the service, the congregation spilled into the yard, forming clusters and conversations. Margaret started toward the wagon, but Clara tugged her toward a group of women standing beneath a cottonwood tree. "Mrs. Whitmore," Clara said quietly, "we should pay respects. We should get home." "Please." The girl's voice carried an edge of desperation. "Papa says we can't afford to seem rude." So Margaret followed, though every instinct screamed retreat. Eleanor Whitmore stood at the center of her circle like a sun, with the other women orbiting dutifully around her. She was older than Margaret had first thought, maybe 40, but maintained with the kind of care that money bought. No sun damage on that skin, no calluses on those hands. "Clara, darling," Eleanor said, her voice honey over steel. "How lovely to see you, and this must be your father's new employee."
"Margaret Hale," Margaret said evenly. "I'm the cook at Silver Creek." "How practical." Eleanor's eyes traveled over her, the same assessment Margaret had endured 100 times, 1,000 times. "You're quite tall, aren't you?" "I am." "And you've come from—" "The last place I worked." A ripple of displeasure crossed Eleanor's perfect face. She wasn't used to evasion, to people who refused to be catalogued and filed. "Well," Eleanor said, recovering her smile, "we're always glad to welcome new souls to our little community, though I must say, Lucas Bennett does have the most interesting hiring practices. First that Chinese gentleman, and now—" She let the sentence dangle, the unfinished thought more damning than any completed insult. Margaret felt Clara's hand tighten on hers, saw the girl's face flush with shame, not for herself, but for her father, for the ranch, for the endless litany of failures that the town never let them forget. "Mr. Bennett hired me because I can cook," Margaret said quietly, "and because he needed someone who could do the work without needing the town's permission first." The air went sharp. Eleanor's smile froze. "Well," one of the other women said quickly, "we're so glad you could join us for worship, Miss Hale. Will we see you at the quilting circle on Thursday?" "I work on Thursday." "Of course. Work." Eleanor reclaimed control of the conversation. "How admirable. Though I do hope you'll find time for more elevating pursuits. We wouldn't want you to become too isolated out there at the ranch. Bad things happen when people don't maintain proper connections." It wasn't a threat, not quite, but it was close enough. Margaret met Eleanor's eyes and smiled, not warmly, but with the cold certainty of someone who'd fought battles before and knew she'd fight them again. "I'll keep that in mind, Mrs. Whitmore." She guided Clara away, back toward the wagon where Lucas waited. They rode home in silence, the girl pressed against her side, Lucas's jaw tight with unspoken thoughts. "I shouldn't have come," Margaret said finally. "No." Lucas's hands were white-knuckled on the reins. "You should have, but I should have warned you. Eleanor Whitmore runs this town the way a general runs a war. Cross her, and she'll make sure you pay for it." "I didn't cross her, I just didn't bow." To Eleanor, that's the same thing. Back at the ranch, Margaret threw herself into work. She scrubbed and organized, planned menus, and inventoried supplies. The kitchen became her fortress, her kingdom, the one place where size didn't matter and difference was an asset. Clara helped when she could, soaking up instruction like drought-starved earth drinking rain. The girl had a natural sense for cooking, an instinct for temperature and timing that couldn't be taught. Under Margaret's guidance, she bloomed. "Why does the batter have to rest?" Clara asked one afternoon, watching Margaret make biscuits. "Gives the flour time to hydrate, makes the texture better." "How do you know?" "Trial and error, lots of error." Margaret smiled. "Cooking's not magic, Clara. It's just chemistry and attention." "Mama used to say cooking was love." Margaret's hand stilled. "Your mama was right, but love's not just the making. It's also the showing up, the doing it again when you're tired, the not giving up when it goes wrong." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you going to give up?" "On what?" "On us. On here." Margaret looked at this small, fierce girl who'd learned too young that people left, that love was temporary, that even home could be taken away. "No," she said. "I'm not." "You promise?" "I promise." It was a dangerous promise, a foolish one, but Margaret meant it, and Clara heard the truth in it, and something between them solidified into something stronger than employment, deeper than circumstance. The hands noticed the change in the kitchen. They noticed the food getting better, the routine becoming smoother, the way Clara laughed sometimes now,
high and bright like a bird that had remembered how to sing. "You're good for the kid," one of them, Sam the foreman, said to Margaret one evening. She was getting too quiet, too lost in her own head. She just needed someone to listen. More than that, Sam leaned against the doorframe, his weathered face serious. She needed someone who didn't need her to be something she's not. Someone who let her be enough just as she is. Margaret understood then. Clara saw in her what she needed to see in herself. Proof that different didn't mean defective. That taking up space wasn't a sin. That you could be too big for the world's liking and still be exactly right. But while the ranch became home, the town became enemy territory. Eleanor Whitmore's war started quietly. Supplies ordered from the general store arrived incomplete or damaged. The butcher suddenly ran out of decent cuts when Margaret came to shop. Women pulled their children away when she walked past, as if sighs were contagious. Margaret endured it. She'd endured worse. Then Eleanor escalated. The banker called in a loan Lucas had been reliably paying. The minister suggested from the pulpit that Christian charity had its limits, that some differences were too fundamental to bridge. And Eleanor herself paid a visit to Silver Creek Ranch. She arrived in a carriage dressed like visiting royalty, accompanied by two other women whose names Margaret didn't know and didn't care to learn. Lucas met them on the porch. Margaret watched from the kitchen window, Clara beside her. "Mr. Bennett," Eleanor said, not bothering with pleasantries, "I've come on behalf of the Ladies' Betterment Society. We're concerned about certain developments at your ranch." "What developments would those be, Mrs. Whitmore?" "The moral education of your daughter, for one. Clara is at an impressionable age. The influences she's exposed to will shape her entire future." Lucas's voice went cold. "My daughter is fine." "Is she? With only rough men and an unusual woman for company?" "Lucas, be reasonable. The girl needs proper female guidance. Refinement, culture, things that can only be found in a civilized environment. Things you'd be happy to provide, I suppose." "We have an excellent finishing school in Denver. The society would be willing to sponsor Clara's tuition. It's the Christian thing to do." In the kitchen, Clara made a small, wounded sound. Margaret put a hand on her shoulder. "Clara stays here," Lucas said flatly. "Then perhaps you should reconsider your other household arrangements. For her sake. People talk, Lucas. They wonder about a single man, a young girl, and a woman of such questionable background all living under one roof. Margaret is my cook. That's all anyone needs to know." "Yes, your cook. Your large unmarried cook who lives in your home and has access to your daughter." Eleanor's voice sharpened. "I'm sure the arrangement is perfectly innocent. But appearances matter, Lucas. They matter to the bank when you need loans. They matter to the buyers when you're selling cattle. They matter to everyone who decides whether your ranch succeeds or fails." The threat was clear. Accept Eleanor's vision for Clara's future, or watch the ranch collapse. Lucas stood silent for a long moment. Then, "Get off my land." "Excuse me." "You heard me. Get off my land, and don't come back unless you're invited." Eleanor's face flushed. "You're making a terrible mistake." "Maybe, but it's my mistake to make." The carriage pulled away in a cloud of dust and outrage. Lucas stood on the porch long after it disappeared, his shoulders tight with strain. Margaret found him there as the sun set, painting the prairie in shades of blood and gold. "You shouldn't have done that," she said quietly. "Probably not. She'll make you pay for it. I know." "Lucas." She wanted to take Clara. He turned to face her, and Margaret saw something raw in his expression. "She wanted to take my daughter and turn her into one of them. Polished and proper and dead inside. I'd burn this ranch to the ground before I'd let that happen. It might come to that. Then it does." He was close enough now that she could see the lines around his eyes, the gray threading through his hair. "You asked me once what Clara wanted. Well, I'm asking you now. What do you want, Margaret?" The question caught her off guard. No one had asked her that in years. What she wanted had never mattered. She was hired help, temporary labor, the woman who cooked and cleaned and left when the season changed. But standing here in the fading light, with this broken ranch and this stubborn man and this lonely child who'd somehow become her family, Margaret found herself saying the truth. "I want to stay. Even if it gets hard?" "It's already hard, but I'm good at hard." Lucas smiled then, tired and real. "Yeah, You are. Inside, Clara was setting the table for supper. Margaret watched her through the window. This girl, who'd been told she needed fixing, who'd learned to make herself small to fit the spaces others demanded. We're going to teach her something better, Margaret said. What's that? That she's enough, exactly as she is, and that anyone who says different can go to hell. Lucas laughed, startled and genuine. You don't talk like a cook. I don't cook like a cook either. I cook like someone who refuses to be beaten. Good, Lucas said, because beating is what Eleanor Whitmore does best, and she's just getting started. He was right. Within a week, 3 of the hands quit, offered better wages at the neighboring ranch, Eleanor's brother-in-law's spread. The general store refused to extend credit. The bank sent another letter about the loan. Margaret watched Lucas age in days what should have taken years. Watched him make hard choices about which bills to pay, which supplies to do without, which dreams to defer. But she also watched him refuse to break, and in the kitchen, she built her own quiet resistance. She stretched supplies further than seemed possible. She foraged for wild greens and taught Clara to identify edible plants. She traded her baking, which was exceptional, for goods and services, building a network that bypassed Eleanor's control. Where did you learn to do this? Lucas asked one night, watching her turn a handful of ingredients into a meal that would feed 12. Necessity, Margaret said. I've been poor before. I know how to make nothing into something. You're keeping us afloat. We're keeping each other afloat. It was true. Lucas worked himself near to collapse, keeping the ranch running. Clara helped where she could, learning ranch work alongside cooking. And Margaret held the center, the hearth, the place they returned to at the end of each brutal day. They became a unit. Not quite a family, the word felt too presumptuous, but something close, something that mattered. And then Eleanor played her trump card. The notice appeared in the town's newspaper, such as it was, a single-page weekly that mostly carried advertisements and gossip disguised as news. Annual Baking Competition. Ladies of Dry Ridge are invited to participate in the 5th annual baking competition, to be held at the town social hall on the last Saturday of August. Categories include pies, cakes, and breads. All entries will be judged by an impartial panel, and winners will receive ribbons and recognition. This year's competition is sponsored by the Ladies Betterment Society. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, 4-time champion, is expected to defend her title. Clara brought the paper home, her eyes bright with something dangerous. You should enter, she said to Margaret. Absolutely not. Why not? You're the best baker I've ever seen. That's not the point. Then what is? Margaret looked at this girl who'd grown bold under her care, who'd learned to take up space and speak her mind, and she realized Clara was right. This wasn't about baking, it was about power, about who got to decide what was excellent and what was acceptable, about whether someone like Margaret, too big, too different, too much, could compete in Eleanor Whitmore's world and win. It's a trap, Margaret said finally. Eleanor wants me to enter so she can crush me publicly. Maybe, Clara said. Or maybe she's afraid you'll win. Lucas came in from the barn, caught the end of the conversation. Win what? The baking competition, Clara said. Margaret should enter. Margaret should stay as far away from Eleanor's games as possible. Why? Clara's voice rose, challenging. Because we're supposed to hide? To keep our heads down and hope the town forgets we exist? That's what we've been doing for years, Papa, and it hasn't worked. They still hate us. They still want us gone. Clara, Margaret taught me that being different isn't wrong, that taking up space isn't a sin. But if we keep hiding, we're saying they're right about us, that we should be ashamed. In the silence that followed, Margaret felt something shift. The girl was right. Hiding hadn't saved them. Compliance hadn't bought peace. The town would come for them whether they fought back or not. So maybe it was time to fight. I'll enter, Margaret said quietly. Lucas turned to her. You don't have to do this. I know, but I'm going to. Eleanor will cheat. She'll stack the judges, sabotage your entry, do whatever it takes to make sure you lose. Probably. So why do it? Margaret thought about every kitchen she'd ever worked in, every town she'd passed through, every person who'd looked at her and decided she was less because of how she looked. She thought about Clara, learning to be brave, about Lucas, fighting to keep his daughter in his ranch, about herself, tired of shrinking. Because I'm tired of losing by default, she said. If I'm going to lose, I want to lose fighting. Lucas studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. All right, but if you're going to fight, you fight to win. What do you need? Time, space, the best ingredients we can get. You'll have them. Over the next 3 weeks, Margaret worked like a woman possessed. She tested recipes, refined techniques, pushed herself to create something extraordinary. Clara helped, learning advanced methods, understanding the chemistry of perfection. The other hands noticed. They started finding excuses to linger in the kitchen, watching Margaret work with the kind of reverence usually reserved for artists or saints. What are you making? Sam asked one evening. A cake, Margaret said. 7 layers, orange cream filling, candied citrus garnish. Jesus. No, better. The day of the competition arrived hot and merciless. Margaret loaded her entry into the wagon with the care usually reserved for carrying nitroglycerin. Lucas drove, Clara beside him, both silent with nerves. The social hall was already crowded when they arrived. Women clustered around tables displaying their entries, each one trying to look modest while clearly dying for admiration. Eleanor Whitmore held court at the center, her own entry, a towering white cake decorated with what looked like real pearls, positioned like a throne. Margaret carried her cake through the crowd. Women stepped back to let her pass, their eyes sharp with judgment and poorly concealed hope that she'd fail. She set her entry on the display table. 7 perfect layers, golden and even, held together with orange cream so smooth it looked like silk. The candied citrus on top caught the light like amber. Eleanor approached, all false sweetness. Miss Hale, how ambitious of you to enter. Though I must say attempting something so complex for your first competition is rather bold. I'm a bold person, Mrs. Whitmore.
Yes, I've noticed. Eleanor's eyes traveled over the cake, looking for flaws. Margaret watched her expression shift when she found none.
Well, may the best woman win. That's the plan.
The judges deliberated for what felt like hours. They cut into each entry, tasted, conferred in whispers. Margaret stood with Lucas and Clara, trying to look calmer than she felt. This mattered. More than it should. More than was rational. But it did. Finally, the head judge, the minister's wife, who at least had the decency to look uncomfortable, stepped forward. The winner of this year's baking competition, she announced, is Miss Margaret Hale for her orange cream layer cake. The silence was deafening. Then Clara whooped, loud and unladylike, and threw her arms around Margaret's waist. Lucas smiled, quiet and proud, and Margaret walked forward to accept a ribbon that meant nothing and everything. Eleanor Whitmore's face was a study in controlled rage. She clapped along with everyone else, but her eyes promised war. Margaret had won the battle. But the war was just beginning. The ribbon hung on the kitchen wall like a declaration of war. Margaret knew what was coming. She'd lived long enough to understand that victories like hers didn't go unpunished, especially not in towns like Dry Ridge, where the social order was maintained through carefully calibrated cruelty. Eleanor Whitmore had built her empire on the understanding that people knew their place and stayed in it. Margaret had just burned that understanding to the ground in front of half the town. The first strike came 3 days later. Sam rode in from town with the supply wagon, his face tight. He found Margaret in the kitchen, elbow deep in bread dough, and set a crate on the table with more force than necessary. "This is all Hendricks would sell me," he said. Margaret wiped her hands and looked inside. Half the flour she'd ordered, no sugar at all. The coffee was the cheap stuff that tasted like dirt, and the lard had clearly been sitting in the back of the store since before statehood. He say why? Said his distributor was running low. Said times are tight, and he has to prioritize his regular customers. Sam's jaw worked. Also said maybe we should try shopping in the next county if we're not satisfied with his service. Eleanor. Obviously. Sam leaned against the counter. It's going to get worse, Margaret. She's got the whole town scared of her. Anyone who helps us risks the same treatment. Margaret looked at the pitiful supplies, calculating. She had enough flour in the pantry to last maybe 2 weeks if she stretched it. The sugar she could do without. Honey would work for most things. But coffee? The hands would mutiny without coffee. We'll make it work, she said. How? Same way I always have, by being more stubborn than the people trying to break me. Clara appeared in the doorway, her face flushed from running.
Mrs. Patterson just came by. She says the Ladies' Betterment Society is meeting tomorrow to discuss the competition results. She says Eleanor is saying you cheated. How exactly does one cheat at baking? She's saying you must have had help, that someone with your background couldn't possibly create something so refined without assistance. Margaret felt the familiar burn of rage in her chest, but she kept her voice level. My background being what exactly? Clara looked at the floor. She didn't say it directly. She just implied that someone of your size and appearance couldn't have the delicacy required for fine baking. Jesus Christ, Sam muttered. It's fine, Margaret said, though it wasn't. It would never be fine. But she'd learned to carry this particular weight the way she carried everything else, silently, without asking for help. Let Eleanor say what she wants. The judges tasted my cake. They know what they ate. But if she convinces people you cheated, then I'll enter next year and win again. Lucas came in from the barn, took one look at their faces, and said, What happened? Sam explained about the supplies. Clara told him about Eleanor's accusations. Lucas listened in silence, his expression darkening with each sentence. I'll talk to Hendricks, he said finally. That won't help, Margaret said. He's already chosen his side. Then I'll find another supplier. There's a store in Cedar Falls. That's 40 miles each way. You don't have time for that run every week, not with fall work coming. So what do you suggest? We let Eleanor starve us out? Margaret pulled the bread dough from the bowl, slapped it onto the floured counter. The physical act of kneading helped her think, helped her channel the anger into something productive. We adapt, she said. We find other sources. We trade with the smaller ranches, the ones Eleanor doesn't control. We forage. We make do. For how long? As long as it takes. Lucas watched her work the dough, his eyes shadowed. This is my fault. I should never have let you enter that competition. You didn't let me do anything. I made my own choice. A choice that's going to make your life hell. Margaret looked up at him, her hands still moving in the rhythm she could do in her sleep. My life's been hell before, Lucas. I know how to survive it. Survival isn't enough. It is when it's all you've got. The silence that followed was broken by Clara's small voice. I'm glad you won. They all turned to look at her. The girl stood straighter, her chin lifted in defiance. I'm glad you beat her, Clara continued. I'm glad everyone saw that she's not the best at everything. That someone like you, someone who doesn't fit their rules, can be better than all of them. Clara, Lucas started. No, Papa. Margaret did something brave. She showed them they're wrong about her, about us. And if we have to eat beans and cornbread for a year because of it, that's fine. At least we'll be eating it with our pride intact. Margaret felt something crack open in her chest. This girl, this fierce little warrior who'd learned to fight because Margaret had shown her how, she made it all worth it. Every insult, every hardship, every battle yet to come. We're not going to eat beans and cornbread for a year, Margaret said. We're going to eat well, and we're going to do it without giving Eleanor Whitmore the satisfaction of seeing us struggle. How? Sam asked. Margaret smiled, sharp as a knife. By being smarter than she is. Over the next week, Margaret put her plan into action. She rode out to the smaller homesteads, the ones scratching survival from soil that didn't want to cooperate, and she made trades. Her bread for their eggs, her preserves for their vegetables, her baked goods for whatever they could spare. The people she traded with were wary at first. They knew the risks of crossing Eleanor, but they were also tired of being squeezed, tired of watching their own supplies get more expensive while the general store's profits grew. And Margaret's baking was too good to resist. You're building a network, Lucas said one evening, watching her tally the day's trades in a small notebook. I'm building insurance. Eleanor won't like it. Eleanor can go to hell. He laughed, startled. You know, when you first arrived, I thought you'd last maybe a month. You seemed too soft. Soft? Not in body, in spirit. Like someone who'd been beaten down so many times she'd stopped fighting back. Margaret set down her pencil. What changed your mind? Clara, the way you looked at her that first day when she asked if you were going to leave, you made a promise you had no business making to a child you barely knew, in a situation that was clearly temporary. He paused. But you meant it, and you've kept it. I don't break promises to children. Most people do. Then most people are cowards. Lucas moved closer,
close enough that she could smell the barn on him, the sweat and hay and honest work. Eleanor is going to keep pushing. She won't stop until she's driven you away or destroyed you completely. I know. And you're still staying. I promised Clara. I promised you, even if I didn't say it out loud, and I don't break my promises. He reached out, and for a moment Margaret thought he might touch her face, might bridge the gap between employer and employee into something more dangerous. But his hand stopped midair, hovered, then dropped. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For being more stubborn than you are afraid. After he left, Margaret sat in the kitchen darkness and let herself feel the thing she'd been avoiding, the want, the hunger that had nothing to do with food and everything to do with the way Lucas looked at her sometimes, like she was something rare and worth protecting. But she'd learned long ago that want was dangerous for women like her. Want led to hope, and hope led to heartbreak when men realized what they'd actually gotten. A woman too big, too plain, too much work for the pleasure she might provide. Better to keep it simple, keep it professional, keep her heart locked away where it couldn't be used against her. The next Sunday, Margaret skipped church. She told Lucas she had too much work, which was true, and that she didn't need to give Eleanor another opportunity to sharpen her knives, which was truer. But Clara came back from town with news that made Margaret regret the decision. Eleanor announced a new initiative, the girl said, bursting into the kitchen. The Ladies' Betterment Society is starting a fund to help unfortunate children get proper educations. She said in front of everyone that she's already identified several candidates who would benefit from being removed from unsuitable home environments. Margaret's hand stilled over the vegetables she was chopping. She said your name. She didn't have to. Everyone knew who she meant. Clara's voice shook with fury. Mrs. Patterson actually stood up and asked if the society would be evaluating all children, or just those in homes that didn't meet moral standards. Eleanor said the society had to be selective, that limited resources meant helping those most in need of rescue. Rescue, Margaret repeated flatly. Papa looked like he wanted to hit her, but he just sat there. Because what can he do? She's not making direct accusations. She's just planting seeds, making people wonder if I'm safe here, if you're a bad influence, if the ranch is an appropriate place for a child. Margaret set down her knife before she cut herself. Her hands were shaking with rage. Where's your father now? In the barn. He's been out there since we got back. Margaret found him in the tack room, viciously cleaning a saddle that was already clean. He didn't look up when she entered. I'm going to lose her, he said. Eleanor's going to manufacture some crisis, get the law involved or the church or whoever she needs, and she's going to take my daughter. Not if we don't let her. How do we stop her? She controls everything. The bank, the merchants, the social structure. She can strangle us financially or socially, and either way we end up broken. Margaret sat on a hay bale, felt it compress under her weight. Then we don't play her game. We change the rules. What does that mean? It means we make it impossible for her to paint us as immoral or unfit. We become so publicly respectable that her accusations look like what they are, petty vengeance. Lucas finally looked at her. How? Margaret had been thinking about this since Clara's report, turning it over in her mind like a puzzle. The solution was obvious, even if the implications terrified her. You need a wife, she said. Clara needs a mother. Someone respectable, someone who can't be questioned or removed. Someone already living under your roof who knows Clara and cares about her. Understanding dawned in Lucas's eyes. Margaret, it would be a practical arrangement, a business agreement. You'd get respectability and protection for Clara. I'd get security in a home that can't be taken away on Eleanor's whim. You'd marry me to spite Eleanor Whitmore? I'd marry you to protect Clara. The spite is just a bonus. Lucas stood, crossed the small space between them. And what about what you want? What about your life, your future? This is my life. This ranch, this kitchen, that girl who thinks I hung the moon. I don't have a future beyond what I build here. That's not true. It is. Margaret made herself say it, made herself speak the truth she usually kept locked away. I'm 32 years old. I'm built like a draft horse and about as pretty. No man is going to court me for love, Lucas. If I'm going to marry anyone, it might as well be someone I respect who needs what I can provide. That's the saddest thing I've ever heard. It's realistic. It's defeat. It's survival. They stared at each other, the air thick with things neither of them could say.
Finally, Lucas said, "If we do this, it's real, not just on paper. Clara's smart enough to know the difference between a real marriage and a pretense, and I won't lie to her about something this important." Margaret's heart hammered. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying if you're going to be my wife, you're going to be my wife. You'll share my name, my home, my life, not just my kitchen." "Lucas, I'm not proposing romance, Margaret. I know neither of us is fool enough for that. But I'm also not proposing a sham. We're both too old and too tired for games." Margaret thought about what he was offering. A real place in the world, a name that meant something, a child to raise, and a man who wouldn't expect her to be anything other than what she was. It wasn't love, but maybe love was a luxury neither of them could afford anyway. "All right," she said. "All right. Yes, I'll marry you." Lucas exhaled, long and slow. "We'll do it this Sunday. Public ceremony, full town attendance. Make it impossible for Eleanor to claim it's anything but legitimate. She's going to lose her mind. Good, let her." They told Clara that night, before either of them could lose their nerve. The girl listened in silence, her face unreadable. "Are you doing this because of what Eleanor said?" she asked finally. Lucas crouched down to her level. "I'm doing this because Margaret is already family, and it's time we made it official, and because you deserve a mother who's here by choice, not duty." Clara turned to Margaret. "Do you want to marry Papa?" The question was too direct, too honest. Margaret could have lied, could have softened it, but Clara deserved the truth. "I want to stay here," Margaret said. "I want to be part of this family, this ranch, this life. If that means marrying your father, then yes, I want it." "Even though people will talk?" "People have always talked about me, Clara. At least this time I'll give them something worth discussing." Clara smiled then, sudden and bright. "Can I call you Mama?" Margaret's throat closed. She nodded, not trusting her voice. The girl launched herself at Margaret, wrapping thin arms around her waist. "I knew you'd stay," she whispered. "I knew you wouldn't leave like everyone else." Over Clara's head, Margaret met Lucas's eyes. They were doing this. They were really doing this. The announcement hit Dry Ridge like dynamite. Lucas made it official on Thursday, posting notice at the general store, the saloon, and the church. Margaret Hale and Lucas Bennett would be married on Sunday following services. All were welcome to attend. By Friday, the entire town was buzzing. By Saturday, Eleanor Whitmore had organized her response. She appeared at the ranch in the afternoon, alone this time, her carriage kicking up dust that settled on everything like accusation. Margaret met her at the door. She didn't invite her in. "Mrs. Whitmore," Margaret said evenly. "Miss Hale. Or should I say, the future Mrs. Bennett." Eleanor's smile was poisonous. "How convenient for you. Landing a husband and a home through proximity and desperation. Was there something you needed?" "I came to offer some friendly advice, woman to woman." Eleanor's eyes were cold as January. "You're making a terrible mistake. Lucas Bennett is a failing rancher clinging to the memory of better days. He's drowning in debt, his land is mortgaged to the hilt, and his prospects are grim. Marrying him won't improve your station. It will drag you down with him." "Thank you for your concern." "I'm not concerned for you. I'm concerned for Clara. That child deserves better than watching her father's desperation play out through an obviously mercenary marriage." Margaret felt her temper slip its leash. "You want to talk about Clara's welfare? Let's talk about it. You've spent months trying to separate a child from her father, to ship her off to strangers so you can control this family's future. You've sabotaged their business, poisoned their reputation, and done everything in your considerable power to destroy them. And you have the audacity to lecture me about what's best for that girl?" Eleanor's face flushed. "I'm trying to save Clara from a life of mediocrity and hardship, from growing up rough and uncivilized, from becoming someone like you." "Someone like me," Margaret repeated. "You mean someone who works, someone who doesn't need other people's approval to know her worth, someone who builds instead of tears down. I mean someone who will never belong, someone who will always be too much of everything except what matters." Eleanor stepped closer, her voice dropping to a hiss. "You think winning a baking competition changed anything? You think marrying Lucas Bennett will make you acceptable? You will always be the oversized cook who trapped a desperate man, and this town will never let you forget it. I don't need this town's acceptance, Mrs. Whitmore. I never did. That's the difference between us. You need everyone to bow down, to acknowledge your supremacy. I just need to be left alone to do my work and love my family. Your family, Eleanor laughed. Is that what you think this is? Lucas is using you for respectability and household help. Clara is a child who'll grow up and realize what you really are. You're not building a family. You're building a cage that will trap you all in mediocrity. We're done here, Margaret said. Get off this property. Or what? You'll throw me off yourself? That would certainly confirm everything I've said about your coarseness. Margaret smiled, cold and real. No, Mrs. Whitmore. I'll ask the sheriff to remove you for trespassing, which I believe is well within my rights as the future mistress of this ranch. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. This isn't over. No, but it's over for today. After Eleanor's carriage disappeared, Margaret found her hands shaking. She gripped the porch railing, forced herself to breathe. That was incredible, Clara said from behind her. Margaret turned. The girl stood in the doorway, her eyes shining with something between awe and fierce joy. You shouldn't eavesdrop. I wasn't. I just heard the interesting parts. Clara came to stand beside her. She's terrified of you. She's angry, not terrified. No, she's terrified, because you're the first person who's ever stood up to her and didn't break. And she doesn't know what to do with that. Margaret pulled the girl close. She's going to keep trying. She's going to make the wedding as difficult as possible, and she's going to keep attacking us after. I know, but we're stronger than she is. We have something she doesn't. What's that? Each other. Sunday morning dawned clear and merciless. Margaret dressed in her best dress, which still strained across her shoulders and pulled at the seams, and tried not to think about walking into that church, knowing half the congregation wanted her to fail. Clara helped her with her hair, pinning it back in a style that was almost elegant. You look beautiful, the girl said. I look presentable. You look like someone who's about to become my mother. That makes you beautiful. Lucas appeared in the doorway, wearing a suit that had seen better years but was clean and pressed. He looked nervous, which made Margaret feel slightly better about her own terror. Ready? He asked. No, but let's do it anyway. The church was packed. Apparently nothing drew a crowd like watching the town pariah marry the town failure in front of the town tyrant. Eleanor sat in her usual pew, her face composed in an expression of serene superiority, but Margaret saw the tightness around her eyes, the rigid set of her shoulders. The ceremony was brief. The minister clearly wanted it over with as quickly as possible. Margaret spoke her vows in a voice that didn't shake, even though her insides were churning. Lucas slid a simple gold band onto her finger, his mother's ring, he'd told her, the only piece of jewelry the ranch still owned. I now pronounce you man and wife, the minister said, with all the enthusiasm of someone announcing a funeral. Lucas kissed her, quick and chaste, a seal on a contract more than a gesture of affection. But his hand was warm on her waist, and when he pulled back, his eyes held something that looked almost like hope. Mrs. Bennet, he said quietly. Mr. Bennet. They walked back down the aisle together, and Margaret felt every eye on her, judging, calculating, waiting for her to stumble. She didn't. Outside, a few people offered perfunctory congratulations. Most simply stared. Eleanor swept past without a word, her silence more damning than any comment. Back at the ranch, Sam and the other hands had set up tables in the yard. They'd pooled their money for supplies, brought what they could spare, built a wedding feast from scraps and determination. You didn't have to do this, Margaret said, her throat tight. Yeah, we did, Sam replied. You're family now. Official and everything. They ate and drank and toasted the unlikely couple. Clara glowed with happiness. Lucas smiled more than Margaret had ever seen him smile. And for a few hours, the weight of Eleanor's animosity and the town's judgment lifted. As evening fell and the hands drifted back to the bunkhouse, Margaret found herself alone with Lucas on the porch. The reality of what they'd done settling over both of them like dust. I meant what I said earlier, Lucas said finally. This is real. You're my wife, Margaret, not just in name. I know. I won't. I don't expect anything you're not willing to give, but I also won't pretend this is purely business. Margaret looked at him. This man who'd hired her when no one else would, who'd stood up to Eleanor for her, who'd offered her a place when she'd long since stopped looking for one. What are you willing to give? She asked. Honesty, respect, partnership, a life that's probably going to be harder than either of us wants, but at least we'll face it together. That's more than most people get. Is it enough? Margaret thought about all the things she'd wanted in her life that she'd never gotten. Romance, beauty, easy acceptance, a body that fit the world's expectations, love that came without conditions or caveats. But she also thought about what she had. A child who looked at her like she'd hung the stars. A man who saw her as capable, not just convenient. A home that was hers, truly hers, for the first time in her adult life. It's enough, she said. Lucas took her hand, the one wearing his mother's ring. Then we'll make it work. Even when Eleanor comes at us again? Especially then. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge. And Margaret allowed herself to hope. Not for easy happiness, but for something better. For a life built on bedrock instead of sand. For a family forged in fire that couldn't be broken by ice. The war with Eleanor Whitmore wasn't over. It was just beginning. But for the first time in her life, Margaret wasn't facing it alone. Marriage changed nothing and everything. Margaret still woke before dawn to start the kitchen fire. Still kneaded bread with the same rhythm she'd learned 20 years ago. Still served meals to hands who ate like they were racing death and had money on the outcome. But now when Lucas came in from the fields, he kissed her cheek before washing up. Now Clara called her mama without hesitation. Now the room off the kitchen sat empty while Margaret's things migrated slowly into the main bedroom, occupying space beside Lucas's worn shirts and work boots. The town noticed. Of course they noticed. Mrs. Bennet, the postmaster said when Margaret came for the mail, his tone making the title sound like an accusation. Mr. Sykes, heard you and Lucas made it official. Quite the whirlwind romance. Margaret met his eyes. Quite the practical arrangement. He blinked, thrown by her honesty. People expected her to pretend, to dress up the marriage in prettier words. But Margaret was done pretending. Eleanor's response came exactly 1 week after the wedding. The bank called in Lucas's loan. All of it. Payment due in 60 days or the ranch would be foreclosed. Lucas sat at the kitchen table with the letter in his hands, his face the color of old ash. $3,000. I don't have $3,000. I don't have $300. Margaret read the letter over his shoulder. The language was cold, official, devastating. Can they do this? Just demand full payment like that? If they think the loan's at risk, yes, and Eleanor's brother-in-law sits on the bank's board. Lucas's hands shook. She waited until after the wedding, made sure you were tied to this sinking ship before she torpedoed it. There has to be a way, B. There isn't. I've mortgaged everything. The land, the herd, the equipment. I've got nothing left to borrow against. He looked up at her, his eyes hollow. I'm sorry, Margaret. I married you thinking I could protect you, and instead I've dragged you into my ruin. Clara appeared in the doorway, her face pale. Are we going to lose the ranch? Lucas opened his mouth, but no sound came out. No, Margaret said. The word came out harder than she intended, sharp enough to cut. We're not. Margaret, how much can we get for the cattle? Lucas rubbed his face. Market's soft right now, maybe $1,500 if we're lucky. That's half. What about the land itself? It's mortgaged. Selling it would just pay the bank what we already owe them. Margaret's mind raced, calculating, discarding options as fast as she generated them. What if we don't sell everything? What if we drive the cattle to Denver ourselves, cut out the middlemen, get a better price? Denver's 200 miles. The drive alone would cost less than losing the ranch. Margaret pulled out a chair, sat down hard. How much would we need to make in Denver to cover the loan? $3,000 plus the cost of the drive itself. Call it $3,500 to be safe. How many head do we have? About 200. So we'd need to clear $17, $18 a head. Lucas laughed, bitter and tired. Margaret, the going rate is $12. Maybe $13 if you find a desperate buyer. Then we find desperate buyers. We sell direct to butchers, restaurants, anyone who'll pay premium for quality beef. That's not how it works. There's a system, auctions, buyers who... The system is run by people like Eleanor who want us to fail, so we bypass it. Sam had been listening from the doorway. Now he stepped forward. She's right, boss. We've got good cattle, healthy stock, well fed. If we can get them to Denver and sell direct, we could make premium prices. It's a 2-week drive in good weather, Lucas said. We'd need every hand we've got, which means leaving the ranch unprotected. And fall storms are starting. One bad blow could scatter the herd or kill half of them. Or we could lose everything for sure by staying here. Margaret looked at Clara. What do you think? The girl straightened. I think we fight. It's not your decision to make, Clara, Lucas said gently. Yes, it is. This is my home too, and I'm not letting Eleanor Whitmore take it from us without a fight. Margaret saw the moment Lucas broke, not in defeat, but in surrender to the inevitable. He couldn't protect them by playing it safe. Safety was a luxury they couldn't afford. All right, he said quietly. We drive the herd to Denver, but Margaret, you and Clara stay here. I won't risk you both on something this dangerous. No, Margaret said. No? You need every hand you've got. Sam can manage the drive. You need to stay here and protect the ranch from whatever Eleanor tries while you're vulnerable. Lucas stared at her. You're not suggesting... I'm going to Denver. I'll handle the sales while Sam manages the cattle. You stay here with Clara and make sure Eleanor doesn't burn the place down in our absence. Absolutely not. Why? Because I'm a woman? Because I'm your wife? Because you think I can't handle hard travel and harder negotiations? Because I just married you, and I'll be damned if I lose you to a cattle drive gone wrong. The raw honesty in his voice stopped her. Margaret softened her tone. Lucas, think. Eleanor expects you to go. She's probably planning something timed to when you're gone and the ranch is weakest. But if you stay, if you're here to counter whatever she does, we have a chance. And if something happens to you out there, then it happens. But at least we'll have tried. Sam cleared his throat. She's not wrong, boss. With respect, you're better at managing the ranch than selling cattle. And if Eleanor does make a move, Clara needs you here. Lucas looked between them, clearly hating every word. This is insane. This is survival, Margaret corrected. They planned through the night. Sam would lead the drive with 5 of their best hands. Margaret would ride with them, managing the business end while the hands managed the cattle. They'd take the eastern route, following the South Platte River, trading speed for water access. If they pushed hard, they could make Denver in 12 days. You'll need a stake for expenses, Lucas said, pulling a small leather pouch from a drawer. It's not much. $80. It was supposed to be for Clara's birthday, but we'll make it enough, Margaret said. The morning they left, the sky hung low and threatening. Margaret had never sat a horse for more than a few hours, and the prospect of 2 weeks in the saddle made her entire body ache in anticipation. But she swung up onto the mare Sam had chosen for her, a steady older horse who wouldn't spook, and tried to look like she knew what she was doing. Clara ran out as they were mounting up. She threw her arms around Margaret's leg, the only part she could reach. Come back, the girl said fiercely. You promised you wouldn't leave. I'm not leaving. I'm fighting for us. There's a difference. Promise anyway. Margaret looked down at this child who'd become hers through sheer force of will and daily choosing. I promise. Lucas handed her a pistol. Can you shoot? Point and pull the trigger, right? That's the basics. He showed her how to load it, how to check the safety. His hands lingered on hers longer than necessary. Margaret, if anything goes wrong, it won't. But if it does, you leave the cattle and you run. The herd isn't worth your life. The herd is our life, all of our lives. So I'm bringing it to Denver and I'm selling it for enough to save this ranch. He kissed her then, hard and desperate, in front of Sam and the hands and Clara and anyone else who cared to watch. When he pulled back, his eyes were fierce. Then come back to me, he said. Count on it. The drive started well enough. The cattle moved easily in the cool morning air, and the hands knew their work. Margaret rode near the back, staying out of the way, learning the rhythm of the herd. Her thighs screamed by the 3rd hour. By the 6th, she couldn't feel anything below her waist. But she didn't complain, didn't slow down, didn't give Sam any reason to suggest she turn back. They made 15 miles the first day. Margaret could barely dismount when they stopped for the night. Sam had to help her down, and she stood on wobbling legs while her body remembered how to be vertical without a horse underneath it. You'll adjust, he said. Takes about 3 days for your body to stop hating you. What happens after 3 days? Then you just hurt all the time, but you stop noticing. Margaret laughed despite the pain. That's the most honest thing anyone's ever told me. They ate beans and hardtack around the fire. The hands were quiet, tired from the day's work. Margaret sat slightly apart, aware she was an outsider in this male space, this world of cattle and campfires and the kind of rough camaraderie that had no room for women. But then one of the younger hands, Tommy, who'd been with the ranch less than a year, said, "Mrs. Bennett, is it true you beat Eleanor Whitmore at her own baking competition?" "I won first place, yes." "What'd you make?" "Orange cream layer cake." Tommy whistled. "Bet that stuck in her craw." "Like a chicken bone," Margaret said, and the men laughed. "I was there," another hand said. "Watched her face when they announced your name. Thought she was going to swallow her teeth." "She tried to say Margaret cheated," Sam added. "Said someone that big couldn't have the delicate touch for fine baking." The men shifted uncomfortably. Margaret knew what they were thinking, that Eleanor had a point, that size and skill shouldn't go together, that Margaret was an anomaly that made them uneasy. "You know what I think?" Tommy said into the silence. "I think Eleanor's scared of anyone who doesn't need her approval to exist. That's why she goes after people like you, and the boss, and little Clara, because you won't bow down." "That's exactly what she's scared of," Margaret agreed. They fell silent after that, but it was a different silence, more accepting, like she'd passed some test she hadn't known she was taking. The second day brought rain. Not a storm, just steady cold drizzle that soaked through clothes and made the cattle balky. Margaret's coat was useless within an hour. Water ran down her neck, pooled in her boots, turned her hands white and clumsy. By noon, she was shivering so hard she could barely stay in the saddle. Sam noticed. "We need to stop," he called to the other hands. "We need to make miles," Margaret argued through chattering teeth. "We need you alive. What good is getting to Denver if you die of pneumonia before we arrive?" They found shelter in a stand of cottonwoods and built a fire with wood, so wet it barely caught. Margaret huddled close to the flames, trying to remember what warmth felt like. Tommy handed her his extra shirt. "It's not much, but it's dry." "I can't take your—" "Yes, you can. Boss would kill me if I let his wife freeze to death." She changed behind a tree, her fingers so numb she could barely work the buttons. The shirt swallowed her, but it was dry, and that was all that mattered. When she came back to the fire, Sam had coffee brewing. It tasted like dirt and salvation. "This is harder than you thought it would be," he observed. "Everything's harder than I think it will be. I just keep doing it anyway." "Why?" Margaret wrapped her hands around the tin cup, letting the heat seep into her bones. "Because the alternative is giving up, and I don't know how to do that." The rain stopped by evening, but the damage was done. The trail turned to mud that sucked at the horses' hooves and slowed the cattle to a crawl. They made 8 miles instead of 15. At this rate, they'd never reach Denver in time. "We need to push harder tomorrow," Sam said. "Make up the lost miles." "Can the cattle handle it?" "They'll have to. We don't have a choice." That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. Her body hurt in places she didn't know could hurt. The ground was hard and cold beneath her bedroll. Every sound made her hand drift to the pistol Lucas had given her. "You awake?" Sam's voice came from the darkness. "Yes." "Worried?" "Terrified." "Good. That means you understand what we're up against." He moved closer, his shape resolving in the firelight. "But between you and me, I think we're going to make it." "Why?" "Because you're too stubborn to fail. I've seen a lot of people in my time, Mrs. Bennett. The ones who make it aren't the strongest or the smartest. They're the ones who refuse to quit even when quitting makes sense. And you think I'm one of those people? I know you are. You married Lucas knowing the town would crucify you for it. You stood up to Eleanor Whitmore when everyone else caves. You're out here on a cattle drive when you should be home in your kitchen." He paused. "Yeah, you're one of those people." The third day they hit their stride. The sun came out, the trail dried, and the cattle moved like they finally understood the assignment. Margaret's body stopped screaming and settled into a steady ache she could live with. They made 18 miles. The fourth day, 20. By the fifth, Margaret could mount her horse without help and dismount without falling. The hands started treating her like part of the crew instead of a liability. And somewhere in the rhythm of days and miles, she found a kind of peace she'd never experienced before. Out here, nobody cared what she looked like. They cared whether she could keep up, whether she pulled her weight, whether she held together when things got hard. And she could. She did. On the 7th day, they met another drive heading east. The trail boss, a grizzled man who'd been moving cattle since before Margaret was born, looked her over with open skepticism. "Woman on a cattle drive," he said to Sam. "That's a new one." "She's the owner's wife," Sam said, "and the business manager." Business manager. The trail boss spat tobacco juice. "What's a woman know about selling cattle?" Margaret smiled sweetly. "Probably about as much as a man knows about baking a 7-layer cake, which is to say, more than you'd expect if you weren't so busy being surprised." The other hands laughed. The trail boss scowled but moved on. "You handled that well," Sam said after they'd passed. "I've had practice." "At what?" "Being underestimated." Denver appeared on the horizon on the 12th day, exactly when Sam had predicted. Margaret had never been so happy to see a city in her life. Her body was one massive bruise. Her hands were blistered, and she smelled like cattle and campfires and 12 days without a proper bath. But they'd made it. The hard part was just beginning. Margaret had Sam take the herd to the stockyards on the city's edge while she found a hotel. A real bed, a real bath, and time to scrub herself back into something resembling presentable. She had meetings to arrange, buyers to court, a price to negotiate that would save everything she'd come to love. The hotel clerk looked her up and down when she walked in, covered in trail dust and wearing clothes that had seen better weeks. "We don't usually," he started. Margaret pulled out $20, a quarter of their stake, and slapped it on the counter. "I need a room for 3 nights, a bath immediately, and my clothes laundered. Can you manage that, or should I try the next hotel?" The man's eyes went to the money. "Room 12, I'll have a bath sent up within the hour." The water was hot and clean, and Margaret stayed in it until her skin pruned. She scrubbed away the layers of dirt and sweat and fear, watching them swirl down the drain. When she finally emerged, she felt almost human again. Her laundered clothes came back smelling of soap instead of horses. She dressed carefully, trying to look like a serious businesswoman instead of a cook who'd just survived a cattle drive. Her best dress was still too tight across the shoulders, still pulled at the seams, but it would have to do. She spent the afternoon walking Denver's streets, identifying butcher shops, restaurants, hotels, anywhere that might need quality beef and have the money to pay premium prices. She made notes, planned her approach, rehearsed her pitch. That evening, she started making calls. The first butcher laughed in her face. "You're trying to sell me cattle? Lady, I've got contracts with established suppliers. Why would I buy from some ranch woman who wandered in off the street?" "Because my cattle are better. Grass-fed, healthy stock, and I can deliver them tomorrow. Your established suppliers can match that? Price is what matters, and I can get beef for $12 a head." "You can get adequate beef for $12. I'm offering you premium for $17. $17. He laughed again. "You're dreaming. I'm negotiating. What if I throw in the first 5 head at cost? Let you test the quality before committing to the rest." He paused, considering. 5 head at $12? 5 head at cost, which is about $9 once you factor in drive expenses. The rest at $17 if you're satisfied with the quality. And if I'm not satisfied? Then you've gotten 5 head of beef at below market price and I've lost a day. But you will be satisfied. Something in her certainty made him reconsider. "All right, 5 head delivered tomorrow morning. If they're as good as you claim, we'll talk about the rest." Margaret left with a verbal agreement and sweating palms. One butcher down. She needed at least 6 more to move the entire herd at the price they needed. The next morning, Sam delivered 5 prime steers to the butcher's shop. Margaret arrived an hour later to find the butcher examining one of the carcasses with the attention most men reserved for gold. "This is good beef," he admitted grudgingly. "I told you." "All right, I'll take 30 head at $16. 17. 16.50. 17, or I walk and you lose access to beef this good." He glared at her, then he smiled. "You're either very brave or very stupid, negotiating that hard." "I'm desperate, but I'm also right about the quality." 17, but you deliver them processed, not on the hoof. Deal. One sale, 30 head, $510. Margaret spent the next 2 days in a blur of meetings and negotiations. She charmed restaurant owners, badgered hotel managers, convinced grocers and butchers and anyone else who'd listen. Some laughed. Some were intrigued. A few were downright hostile at the idea of a woman handling business that wasn't cooking or cleaning. But Margaret had learned something during her time at Silver Creek. She'd learned that being underestimated was an advantage. People assumed she'd be easy to manipulate, easy to cheat, and when she proved she wasn't, they were caught off balance. By the end of the third day, she'd sold the entire herd. 187 head at an average price of $16.75. The math made her hands shake. $3,147.25. Enough to pay the bank. Enough to save the ranch. Enough to prove that a cook and a failing rancher and their misfit family could beat Eleanor Whitmore at her own game. Sam whooped when she told him. "You did it. You actually did it." "We did it." "No, ma'am. This was all you. We just moved the cattle. You sold them for twice what any of us thought possible." They celebrated that night, Margaret, Sam, and the Hands, in a restaurant that served steaks and whiskey and success. Margaret let herself have one glass, just enough to blur the edges of her exhaustion and fear. To Mrs. Bennet, Tommy raised his glass. "Who's got more grit than any man I've known?" "To surviving Eleanor Whitmore," another hand added. "To going home," Margaret said quietly. They rode back faster than they'd come, unencumbered by cattle, driven by victory and the knowledge of what waited for them. Margaret's body remembered how to hurt, but she barely noticed. She was too busy thinking about Lucas's face when she told him they'd done it, about Clara's smile, about the ranch that was theirs, truly theirs, free from Eleanor's machinations. They were 2 days out when they met the rider. He came from the direction of Dry Ridge, pushing his horse hard. Margaret's stomach dropped before he even spoke. "Sam!" the rider called. It was one of the Hands Lucas had kept at the ranch. His face was grim. "We've got trouble." "What happened?" "Whitmore happened. She waited until word got around about the drive being successful. Then she struck." Margaret's mouth went dry. "What did she do?" "Got the sheriff to investigate the ranch for child endangerment. Said Clara was being kept in unsuitable conditions, that Lucas was an unfit father, that the home environment was dangerous. She's pushing to have Clara removed into her custody pending a full investigation." "That's insane," Sam said. "The ranch is fine. Clara's fine. Doesn't matter. Eleanor's got the law on her side and she's moving fast. Lucas sent me to find you, Mrs. Bennet. He says you need to come back now, that Eleanor's demanding a full hearing in front of the town council and the sheriff, and it's happening in 3 days. Margaret felt the world tilt. They'd won the battle in Denver only to find the war waiting at home, worse than before. "How bad is it?" she asked. The rider met her eyes. "Lucas says if Eleanor gets her way, they'll take Clara. Put her in Eleanor's care until the investigation concludes, which could be months. And once Eleanor has her, she'll find a way to keep her." "Over my dead body," Margaret said. "That's what the boss figured you'd say? That's why he sent me to bring you back fast." They rode through the night and into the next day, stopping only to rest the horses. Margaret pushed herself past exhaustion into a state of numb determination. Her body had nothing left to give, but she gave it anyway. Dry Ridge appeared on the horizon at sunset on the second day. The town looked the same as when she'd left. Weathered buildings, dusty streets, the church steeple pointing at heaven like an accusation. But everything was different now. She was different. She'd driven cattle to Denver, negotiated deals with men who'd tried to cheat her, sold a herd for enough to save a ranch. She'd proven she could do things people said were impossible. And now she was going to prove she could beat Eleanor Whitmore at something more important than baking. She was going to fight for her daughter. Lucas was waiting at the ranch. So was Clara, her eyes red from crying but her jaw set with determination. They crashed into Margaret the moment she dismounted. Lucas's arms tight around her, Clara pressed between them. "You're back," Lucas said into her hair. "Thank God you're back." "I'm back, and I brought $3,000 to pay the bank and enough left over to buy supplies for the next 6 months. He pulled back to stare at her. "You did it." "We did it, but Eleanor is trying to take Clara. The hearing's tomorrow afternoon. The whole town council will be there, plus the sheriff and half of Dry Ridge. She's made it into a public spectacle." "Of course she has." Margaret's exhaustion fell away, replaced by cold fury. "Then we'll give her a spectacle." "Margaret, I don't think you understand how serious this is. Eleanor's claiming the ranch is dangerous, that you're an unsuitable influence, that Clara's being raised without proper moral guidance. She's got witnesses lined up to testify." "Then we'll get our own witnesses." "Who?" "Everyone in this town is either scared of Eleanor or in her pocket." Margaret smiled, sharp and certain. "Not everyone. And the ones who aren't? They're about to remember what courage looks like. She spent the rest of the evening and all the next morning preparing. She visited every family she'd traded with during Eleanor's supply blockade. She talked to the Hands, to Sam, to anyone who'd seen Clara at the ranch and could testify to her well-being. She even rode out to the smaller homesteads, the ones too poor and too proud to bow to Eleanor's pressure. And one by one, they agreed to come. To stand up, to tell the truth. The hearing was held in the town hall, a squat building that usually hosted dances and elections. But today it hosted judgment. Eleanor sat at the front with her lawyers and her witnesses, looking like she'd already won. The town council, 5 men whose collective courage wouldn't fill a teacup, sat behind a long table, trying to look impartial. Margaret, Lucas, and Clara entered together. They took seats at the front, and Margaret felt every eye in the packed room on her. Judging. Waiting. The council chairman called the hearing to order. Eleanor's lawyer stood, crisp in his Eastern suit, and laid out the accusations. Clara Bennett was being raised in unsuitable conditions. Her father was financially unstable. Her stepmother was a woman of questionable background with no qualifications for raising a child. The home environment was rough, uncivilized, potentially dangerous. He called witnesses. Mrs. Whitmore herself, who testified with tears in her eyes about her concern for poor Clara's future. The minister's wife, who spoke about the importance of proper feminine education. The schoolteacher, who noted that Clara had missed several days of school during the cattle drive. Each testimony was a blade, carefully aimed to cut. Then it was their turn. Lucas spoke first, his voice steady, despite the rage Margaret could see in his clenched fists. Clara is my daughter. She's healthy, happy, and loved. This ranch is her home, and it's a good home. Everything Eleanor Whitmore has said here today is a lie designed to destroy my family because we refuse to submit to her control. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Bennett, the chairman said. It's the truth, and I can prove it. Sam stood next, then Tommy, then 3 other hands. Each one testified to Clara's well-being, to the care Margaret showed her, to the ranch's stability. Then the homesteaders came forward. Families Margaret had traded with, who'd seen her with Clara, who knew the truth of who she was. Margaret Bennett is the finest woman I've known, one farmer's wife said. She helped my family when we were starving, traded her baking for what little we could spare. She taught my daughter to read using Clara's school books. If that's unsuitable influence, I don't know what suitable looks like. More voices. More truth. Slowly, the tide in the room began to shift. Finally, Margaret stood. She'd prepared no speech, no carefully crafted argument. She just spoke from the center of her chest, from the place where truth lived. I'm not refined, she said. I'm not elegant or cultured or any of the things Eleanor Whitmore thinks are important. I'm a cook. I'm too big, too plain, too rough around the edges, but I love Clara like she's my own blood. I would die before I'd let anyone hurt her. And this town can judge me all it wants for not fitting their expectations, but it can't deny that I've kept my promises. I said I'd stay, and I stayed. I said I'd fight for this family, and I fought. I just drove 200 head of cattle to Denver and sold them for enough to save this ranch. So if Eleanor wants to take my daughter, she's going to have to go through me. And I promise you, that's a fight she'll lose. The room was silent. Then Clara stood, small and fierce and utterly unafraid. I want to stay with my family, she said, her voice clear. Papa and Margaret are my family. This ranch is my home, and Mrs. Whitmore can't have me. The chairman looked at Eleanor. Eleanor's face was rigid with fury. The council will deliberate, he said. They left the room. 5 minutes passed. 10. Margaret held Clara's hand and tried to breathe. When the council returned, the chairman's face was unreadable. After careful consideration, he said, we find no evidence of unsuitable conditions or endangerment. Clara Bennett will remain in her father's custody. Case dismissed. The room erupted. Clara threw herself at Margaret, sobbing with relief. Lucas pulled them both close, and Eleanor Whitmore stood, her face a mask of cold rage, and walked out without a word. They'd won. For now. Outside the town hall, people Margaret barely knew stopped to congratulate her, to shake Lucas's hand, to tell Clara how brave she was. You did it, Lucas said, his voice rough with emotion. You beat her. We beat her, Margaret corrected. Together. But even as she spoke, she saw Eleanor across the street, watching them with eyes like winter ice. This wasn't over. Eleanor Whitmore didn't lose gracefully, and she didn't forgive. The real war was still coming. Margaret paid off the bank loan 3 days after the hearing, walking into the marble-floored building with $3,000 in cash and a receipt book. The banker counted the money twice, his face tight with disappointment that probably had Eleanor's fingerprints all over it. "This settles the account," he said flatly, stamping the receipt with more force than necessary. "In full?" "In full." Margaret took the stamped paper and walked out into the autumn sunlight, feeling lighter than she had in months. The ranch was theirs now, truly theirs. No one could take it through debt or legal maneuvering or any of Eleanor's carefully orchestrated schemes. But the victory tasted hollow, because Margaret knew what came next. She'd humiliated Eleanor publicly, first at the baking competition, then at the hearing. A woman like Eleanor Whitmore didn't just absorb humiliation, she weaponized it. The first sign came that same afternoon. Lucas found it nailed to the barn door, a notice from the Cattlemen's Association informing him that Silver Creek Ranch had been denied membership in the fall cattle pool. "What does that mean?" Margaret asked, reading over his shoulder. "It means we can't participate in the group drive to market next spring. We'd have to drive our herd alone again, or sell locally at whatever price we can get." Lucas crumpled the notice in his fist. "Eleanor's brother-in-law runs the association. This is her telling us she can still hurt us. Can we survive without the association? Maybe. If we're lucky. If the winter's mild and we don't lose stock, if the market stays stable." He looked at her, his eyes tired. "But it's one more thing stacked against us. One more way she's making success harder." Clara came running from the house, her face pale. "Papa, someone shot one of the chickens." "Shot? Are you sure?" "Come see." The chicken lay in the yard, a neat hole through its breast. Not a predator kill, not an accident. Someone had stood close enough to take aim and pull the trigger. Sam examined the carcass, his face grim. "This was done today, probably while we were all in town at the bank." "A warning," Lucas said, "or a promise." Sam straightened, scanning the horizon. "Whoever did this wanted us to know they can get close, that we're not as safe as we think." Margaret felt ice slide down her spine. "We need to keep Clara close to the house." "I'm not hiding," Clara said, her voice shaking but determined. "You're not hiding. You're being smart." Margaret put a hand on the girl's shoulder. "There's a difference between courage and recklessness, and right now we need to be smart." That night, Lucas posted watches. The hands took turns patrolling the property in shifts, armed and alert. Margaret lay awake in the darkness, listening to every sound, her hand resting on the pistol Lucas had given her for the Denver drive. "This is my fault," Lucas said into the quiet. "How is Eleanor being vicious your fault? I should have bent when I had the chance. Should have sent Clara to boarding school. Should have kept my head down. Should have married someone suitable who would have made peace with the town instead of war." Margaret turned to face him. "You saying you regret marrying me?" "No, God, no. But I regret what it's cost you, what it's going to keep costing." "Lucas, I knew what I was signing up for. I'm not some delicate flower who wilts under pressure. I've been fighting my whole life. This is just a different battlefield." "But you shouldn't have to fight. You should be able to just live." "Should" is a useless word. We deal with what is, not what should be. She found his hand in the darkness, squeezed it. "We're in this together. That's what matters." He pulled her close, and they lay tangled together. Two people too stubborn to break, too tired to do anything but hold on. The attacks continued. Small things at first. Fences cut, tools stolen, supplies that disappeared between the ranch and town. Nothing they could prove. Nothing they could trace back to Eleanor directly. But the message was clear. They would never have peace as long as they refused to submit. Then the letter came. It arrived with the regular mail, addressed to Lucas in crisp handwriting. He read it twice, his face going gray. "What is it?" Margaret asked. He handed it to her without speaking. It was from a lawyer in Denver representing a client who wished to remain anonymous. The client was prepared to offer $15,000 for Silver Creek Ranch, the land, the buildings, and all equipment. The offer was generous, well above market value. It would allow the Bennett family to relocate and start fresh somewhere else without the burden of debt or local animosity.
The offer would remain open for 30 days. After that, the client would pursue other options for acquiring the property. "It's Eleanor," Lucas said. "It has to be." "Probably, but why offer money when she's been trying to destroy us?" "Because she's realized we won't break easily. So she's trying a different approach, make leaving look like the smart choice, the profitable choice." Margaret read the letter again. $15,000. It was a fortune, enough to buy a new ranch somewhere else, somewhere without Eleanor Whitmore's shadow, somewhere they could start over without fighting every day just to survive. "Are you considering it?" she asked carefully. Lucas was quiet for a long moment. "Part of me wants to. Take the money, leave this town in our rear view, give Clara a chance at a normal life somewhere people don't already hate us. And the other part? The other part remembers my father building this ranch from nothing. Remembers my wife dying here, buried in that little plot on the hill. Remembers that running away from Eleanor just proves she was right all along, that we don't belong, that we're not good enough, that people like us should know our place. So we're staying. Are we?" Margaret thought about the question seriously. They could leave, start over, build something new somewhere else. It would be easier, probably smarter. But it would also mean Eleanor won, that her cruelty, her petty vindictiveness, her need to control everyone around her would be validated, and Margaret had spent too much of her life letting people like Eleanor decide where she belonged. "We're staying," she said firmly. "We fought too hard for this place to give it up now." Lucas exhaled, tension leaving his shoulders. "Thank you." "For what?" "For choosing to fight when leaving would be easier, for being as stubborn as I am." "Lucas, I'm more stubborn than you are. That's why this is going to work." They burned the letter in the kitchen stove and watched Eleanor's offer turn to ash. 2 weeks later, Eleanor made her final move. It started with a rumor, whispered in the general store, repeated at church, spread through town like cholera. Silver Creek Ranch was diseased. Several head of cattle had shown signs of anthrax. The herd was contaminated. Anyone who'd bought beef from the Bennett Ranch needed to see a doctor immediately. The rumor was completely false. Their cattle were healthy. Margaret had checked them herself, and Sam had examined every head. But truth didn't matter. Fear did. Within 3 days, every buyer Margaret had cultivated in town and the surrounding area refused to do business with them. The butcher who'd taken their beef on credit demanded his money back. 2 families claimed their children had gotten sick from eating Silver Creek meat and threatened to sue. "She's trying to destroy our reputation," Lucas said, reading the latest accusation. "Make it impossible for us to sell anything we produce. Can we fight it? Get a veterinarian to examine the herd, prove the cattle are healthy." "The nearest qualified vet is in Denver. By the time we get him here and he confirms what we already know, the damage will be done. No one will trust his report anyway. They'll say we paid him off." Margaret slammed her hand on the table hard enough to make the dishes jump. "So we just accept it? Let her destroy us with lies?" "I don't know what else to do." Sam came in from checking the herd, his face troubled. "Boss, we've got a problem. Someone's been cutting our fences again, but this time they herded about 20 head onto Whitmore land." "Whitmore land?" "Her brother-in-law's ranch. The hands over there are saying our cattle crossed onto their property, that we're responsible for the damage to their grazing land. They're threatening to impound the cattle until we pay compensation." Lucas stood so fast his chair fell backward. "This is insane. She can't just steal our cattle." "She can if she controls the sheriff and the local courts." Sam's voice was flat. "And she does." They spent the rest of the day trying to recover the stolen cattle, only to be met by armed hands from the neighboring ranch who claimed they were protecting their employer's property rights. The sheriff, when Lucas appealed to him, said it was a civil matter that would need to be settled in court. The court date was set for 6 weeks out. In the meantime, their cattle remained impounded. "She's bleeding us," Lucas said that night. "Every head we lose is money we can't afford to lose. Even if we win in court, which we probably won't, the cost of feeding those cattle for 6 weeks will be more than they're worth." Margaret was calculating in her head. 20 head, at market value about $240. But the feeding costs, the legal fees, the lost time, Eleanor had found a way to hurt them that cost her almost nothing and them almost everything. "We need a different strategy," she said. "What kind of strategy?" "The kind that hits her where it hurts." "Margaret, no, listen,
Eleanor's power comes from controlling the town's social structure and economy. She decides who succeeds and who fails through her networks and influence. But what if we built our own network? What if we stopped trying to work within her system and created a new one? Lucas looked skeptical. How? Margaret had been thinking about this since the anthrax rumors started. The people Eleanor squeezes the hardest are the small farmers and ranchers, the ones who can't afford her prices, who get pushed out when they can't pay. What if we organized them? Created a cooperative where they could buy supplies together, sell products together, support each other without needing Eleanor's approval. That would take time we don't have. Then we better work fast. Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret rode to every small farm and struggling ranch within 20 miles. She talked to people who'd been denied credit, squeezed on prices, forced to sell at a loss because Eleanor controlled the buyers. And she made them an offer: join together, pool resources, buy supplies in bulk to cut costs, sell products directly to Denver buyers, bypassing the local markets Eleanor controlled. Support each other when Eleanor came after them individually. Some said no. The risk was too high, Eleanor's retribution too certain. But others said yes. Enough others to matter. They held the first meeting in the Silver Creek barn on a cold October evening. 15 families showed up. Small operations, most of them. People who'd been stepped on so many times they'd learned to expect it. Margaret stood before them, Clara beside her for courage, and laid out the plan. "We can't fight Eleanor alone," she said. "She's too powerful, too connected. But together, we can create something she can't touch. A network that doesn't depend on her stores, her buyers, her approval. It won't be easy. She'll come after anyone who joins us. But if we stick together, we can survive what she throws at us." "Why should we trust you?" one farmer asked. "You're the reason Whitmore's on the warpath. Before you showed up and riled her, most of us could keep our heads down and get by." "Getting by isn't living," Margaret shot back. "And keeping your head down just makes it easier for her boot to land on your neck. I'm not asking you to fight because I stirred things up. I'm asking you to fight because you deserve better than what Eleanor Whitmore thinks you're worth." The room was quiet. Then a woman stood, the farmer's wife who testified at the hearing. "Margaret Bennett saved my family when we were starving," she said. "She didn't ask for anything in return, didn't demand gratitude or favors. She just helped because it was right. Now she's asking us to help her, and I'm saying yes. Because people like Eleanor Whitmore only win when good folks are too scared to stand up." One by one, others voiced their support. Not all of them, but enough. They called it the High Plains Cooperative. Margaret drafted the bylaws herself, sitting up late into the night with Lucas helping. They structured it so no one person could control it, so decisions were made collectively, so everyone had a stake in everyone else's success. Eleanor's response was swift and vicious. The bank called in loans for 3 families who'd joined the cooperative. The general store refused to sell to anyone affiliated with it. The minister gave a sermon about the dangers of collective action and the importance of maintaining proper social hierarchies. But the cooperative held. When one family couldn't pay their loan, the others pooled money to help. When the general store refused service, they organized a buying trip to Denver, where they purchased supplies in bulk and distributed them among members. When the minister preached against them, they stopped going to his church and started holding their own services in each other's homes. "You've started a revolution," Sam observed, watching Margaret coordinate a supply delivery. "I've started a survival network. There's a difference." Not to Eleanor, there isn't. He was right. Eleanor saw the cooperative as a direct threat to her control, and she responded accordingly. But this time, she couldn't single out one family to destroy. She'd have to take on all of them, and that was a much harder fight. Then winter came early. The first snow hit in mid-November, weeks before it should have. Not just snow, a full blizzard that buried the prairie under 3 feet of white and dropped temperatures so low that water froze solid in minutes. Lucas and the hands worked around the clock to keep the cattle alive. They broke ice in water troughs, hauled feed through drifts, brought the weakest animals into the barn. Margaret kept the house fires burning and the kitchen producing hot meals for men who came in looking like frozen ghosts. Clara helped where she could, but the cold was too brutal for a child. Margaret kept her inside, teaching her advanced cooking techniques to keep her mind busy while the world outside turned deadly. On the 4th day of the blizzard, one of the hands didn't come back. Tommy had gone out to check the far fence line. When he hadn't returned by dark, Sam organized a search party. They found him an hour later, collapsed in a drift,
his lips blue and his breathing shallow. They carried him back to the house. Margaret stripped off his frozen clothes and wrapped him in blankets while Lucas heated water for the bath that might save his life or might kill him outright if they warmed him too fast. Tommy survived, but he lost 3 fingers to frostbite. Margaret watched Lucas deliver the news to the young man, watched Tommy's face crumple before he forced it back into stoicism. "I can't work a ranch with 7 fingers," Tommy said quietly. "You can work this ranch," Lucas replied. "I don't care if you've got 2 fingers or 20, you're one of us." Margaret felt something crack in her chest. This was what Eleanor would never understand. Loyalty built through shared hardship, love that didn't depend on usefulness, family that chose itself. The blizzard finally broke after 7 days. They emerged to a transformed world, white and deadly and beautiful in the way dangerous things often are. But they'd survived. All of them. The humans, most of the cattle, even the chickens Margaret had been sure would freeze. They'd survived and Eleanor hadn't. Because while the cooperative families had banded together, sharing resources, checking on each other, pooling labor to help the weakest among them, Eleanor's network had fractured. People who'd depended on her stores found them closed during the worst of the storm. Families who'd needed help got none, because asking Eleanor for assistance always came with strings attached. The contrast wasn't lost on the town. After the blizzard, more families asked about joining the cooperative. Not many, but enough to signal that the tide was shifting. "She's losing control," Lucas said, reading the list of new applicants. "She's losing the appearance of control," Margaret corrected. "The actual control is still hers. We're just showing people there's an alternative." "Is that enough?" "It has to be." But Eleanor wasn't finished. She had one more card to play, and she played it in February when the ranch was at its most vulnerable. The notice came from the Territorial Land Office. Silver Creek Ranch's original land grant was being contested. There was a competing claim from a prior owner, and the matter would need to be resolved through legal proceedings. In the meantime, all development and sales of ranch products were suspended pending the outcome. Lucas read the notice 3 times, his hands shaking. "This is impossible. My father filed this claim 40 years ago. It's been settled for decades." Margaret looked over his shoulder. The competing claimant was listed as Whitmore Land Holdings. "She's claiming she has a prior right to this land. It's a fabrication. It has to be. But proving it will take time and money we don't have." "How much time?" "Months. Maybe years if she drags it out. And we can't sell cattle or products legally until it's resolved." Margaret felt the walls closing in. Eleanor had finally found the perfect weapon, one that didn't require proving guilt or manufacturing evidence. Just the threat of legal action was enough to strangle them. "We need a lawyer," she said. "We can't afford a lawyer good enough to fight Eleanor's legal team. Then we find one who'll work for something other than money." She found him in Denver 3 weeks later, a young attorney fresh from law school back east, who'd come west looking for cases that mattered more than money. His name was William Chen, and his father had been the cook Eleanor had driven away from Silver Creek Ranch years before. "I remember your family," William said when Margaret explained the situation. "My father spoke well of Lucas Bennett, said he was a fair man in an unfair world. Will you help us?" "I'll do better than that. I'll bury Eleanor Whitmore in legal motions until she begs to withdraw her claim." "We can't pay you much." "I don't want your money, Mrs. Bennett. I want to watch Eleanor Whitmore lose. My father died still bitter about how she destroyed his reputation in this territory. Consider this payment of a family debt." William Chen was as good as his word. He tore apart Eleanor's claim with the precision of a surgeon, finding every weakness, every fabrication, every procedural error. He filed motion after motion, demanding evidence Eleanor couldn't provide, citing precedents she couldn't overcome. The case dragged through March and into April. Every day felt like drowning. Every night, Margaret lay awake calculating how long they could survive without income, how many cattle they could afford to lose, how much longer they could hold on. Then Clara got sick. It started as a cough, nothing unusual for a child who'd endured a brutal winter, but the cough didn't improve. It got worse, deeper, until Clara was struggling to breathe. Margaret sat by her bedside, pressing cool cloths to the girl's burning forehead, listening to her fight for every breath. "Don't leave me," Clara whispered in a rare moment of clarity. "Never," Margaret promised. "You're stuck with me. Even if I die, you're not going to die. But if I do,
Then I'll be right here. But you're not going to die, Clara Bennett. You're too stubborn for that. The girl smiled weakly. I learned from the best. Lucas wanted to fetch the doctor from town, but Margaret knew what that meant. Exposing their vulnerability to Eleanor, who would absolutely use a sick child as ammunition. Instead, she nursed Clara herself, using every remedy she knew, every trick she'd learned from years of keeping herself and others alive through illness. It took 2 weeks. 2 weeks of terror and sleepless nights and prayers Margaret didn't believe in but said anyway because desperation makes believers of everyone. But Clara survived, weak and thin and pale, but alive. The day she was well enough to sit up and eat solid food, the telegram arrived from Denver. William Chen had won. The land claim was dismissed with prejudice. Eleanor was ordered to pay court costs. Silver Creek Ranch's title was confirmed and protected. Lucas read the telegram out loud, his voice breaking on every word. Clara started crying. Sam whooped loud enough to scare the chickens. And Margaret sat down hard in a kitchen chair and let herself feel something she'd been too terrified to acknowledge. Hope. They'd survived. Against everything Eleanor had thrown at them, the social isolation, the economic warfare, the legal attacks, the brutal winter, the sickness, they'd survived. It's over, Lucas said, pulling Margaret into his arms. Not yet, she replied. Eleanor doesn't give up this easily. But for once, Margaret was wrong. Because Eleanor Whitmore, faced with a legal defeat that had cost her money and reputation, with a town that was slowly turning against her, with a cooperative that continued to grow despite her opposition, finally made the calculation that every tyrant eventually has to make. Was this fight worth what it was costing? And for the first time in her life, Eleanor decided it wasn't. She left Dry Ridge in May, moving to Denver to be closer to her sister. She sold her house, her shares in the local businesses, her influence and her power. She left quietly, without fanfare, without admitting defeat, but also without fighting anymore. Margaret heard the news from the postmaster, who seemed almost disappointed that the war had ended with a whimper instead of a bang. Guess you won, he said, handing her the mail. Nobody won, Margaret replied. We just survived. But surviving felt like winning when you'd expected to lose. That night, the three of them sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and purple. Clara sat between Margaret and Lucas, her head resting on Margaret's shoulder, completely at peace. What happens now? The girl asked. Now we live, Lucas said. We work the ranch. We build the cooperative. We make this place into something good. Will there be more fighting? Probably, Margaret said honestly. There's always someone who wants what you have or doesn't like how you got it. But we know how to fight now, and we know how to survive. Clara was quiet for a moment, then, I'm glad you stayed. Margaret kissed the top of her head. So am I, sweetheart. So am I. The summer after Eleanor left brought changes that felt less like victory and more like the slow, cautious unfurling of something that had been held too tight for too long. The High Plains Cooperative grew to 23 families by July. They met monthly in the Silver Creek barn, sharing information about prices, weather, techniques that worked and failures that didn't. Margaret watched these meetings with something close to pride, though she tried not to let it show. Pride felt dangerous, like tempting fate. You should say something, Lucas whispered during one meeting, nudging her forward. Say what? That this exists because you refuse to give up. That you built this when everyone said it was impossible. Margaret shook her head. I didn't build anything. They did. I just showed them they could. But later, when the families were leaving and one of the newer members, a widow named Sarah Pratt, who was trying to keep her late husband's farm running, stopped to thank her, Margaret felt the words stick in her throat. Before the cooperative, I was going to sell, Sarah said quietly. Couldn't see how to keep going alone, but knowing there are others fighting the same fight, knowing I can ask for help without shame, it changes everything. You would have found a way, Margaret said. You're stronger than you think. Maybe, but I didn't have to find out the hard way. That's worth something. After she left, Clara came to stand beside Margaret in the barn doorway, watching the wagons disappear down the road. You changed things, the girl said. You changed this whole town. I just refused to leave when they wanted me to. That's what I mean. Clara looked up at her, wise beyond her 13 years now.
You showed everyone that staying and fighting is possible, that people like us don't have to accept what people like Eleanor decide we deserve. Margaret pulled her close, breathing in the smell of her hair, sun and soap and the particular scent that meant home. People like us?
People who don't fit, who take up too much space or not enough, who get told they're wrong just for existing. Clara's voice was fierce. You taught me I don't have to apologize for being myself. That's everything, Mama. The word still hit Margaret like a fist to the chest. Mama. She'd never expected to be anyone's mother, had long since accepted that her body and her circumstances had put that dream out of reach. But here was this girl calling her Mama like it was the most natural thing in the world, and Margaret couldn't imagine her life without it. You taught me too, Margaret said quietly. Taught you what? That love doesn't require perfection. That family is what you build, not what you're born into. That fighting for something makes it yours in a way inheriting it never could. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over land that was theirs because they'd refused to let it be taken. The ranch prospered that summer and fall. The cooperative's bulk purchasing drove down costs while their collective selling drove up prices. Lucas hired 2 more hands with the profits, young men who'd been struggling to find work in a territory where Eleanor had blacklisted them for minor offenses, or family connections she didn't approve of. We're becoming a refuge for misfits, Lucas observed one evening, watching the new hands work. Good, Margaret said. Misfits work harder. They know what it costs to lose a place. But prosperity brought its own problems. Success made them visible, and visibility brought attention they didn't necessarily want. A journalist from a Denver newspaper arrived in August, wanting to write about the remarkable woman who'd transformed a failing ranch into a thriving cooperative enterprise. Margaret refused the interview 3 times before Lucas convinced her to reconsider. Why do I need to talk to some reporter? She demanded. I'm not remarkable. I'm just stubborn. You're both. And maybe telling your story helps other people see what's possible. Or it makes us a target again. We're already a target, Margaret. We have been since the day you won that baking competition. Might as well use the attention for something good. She agreed reluctantly, and the interview was as uncomfortable as she'd feared. The journalist, a young woman named Catherine Mills who wore spectacles and took notes in rapid shorthand, asked questions that felt designed to turn Margaret into a symbol rather than a person. Would you say you're a champion of women's rights? Catherine asked. I'd say I'm a woman who wanted to keep her home and her family. The rights part is just what happens when you refuse to accept that you don't have any. But you must acknowledge that your success challenges traditional gender roles. A woman managing cattle sales, organizing economic cooperatives, competing in male-dominated spaces. I don't think about gender roles when I'm negotiating beef prices, Miss Mills. I think about getting the best deal possible so my family can eat and my ranch can survive. If that challenges something, fine. But it's not why I do it. Catherine's pencil paused. Then why do you do it? Margaret thought about the question seriously. Why had she entered the baking competition? Why had she married Lucas? Why had she driven cattle to Denver and built the cooperative and fought Eleanor Whitmore at every turn? Because the alternative was disappearing, she said, finally. And I spent too much of my life trying to disappear, trying to be smaller, quieter, less of whatever people decided was too much. And it never worked. People still saw me, still judged me, still wanted me gone. So I figured if I was going to be visible anyway, I might as well be visible on my own terms. Catherine wrote that down, her expression thoughtful. That's quite profound. It's just survival. The article ran in September, and it was nothing like Margaret expected. Instead of making her into a symbol, Catherine had captured something raw and real. The story of a woman who'd refused to accept the limitations others placed on her, not through grand political statements, but through the daily act of showing up and doing the work. Letters arrived after the article published. Dozens of them, from women across the territory and beyond. Women who felt too big, too different, too much. Women who'd been told to shrink and who were tired of shrinking. Women who wanted to know how Margaret had found the courage to stop apologizing for existing. Margaret read each letter carefully, but she didn't know how to respond. What could she tell them that would matter? That courage was just fear with no other options? That she'd fought because surrender would have killed something in her that she needed to keep breathing? You should answer them, Claire said, watching her read. And say what? The truth. That it's hard. that you're scared sometimes, that you don't have all the answers, but you keep going anyway. So Margaret started writing back. Short letters, honest ones, that spoke to the reality of fighting without promising that fighting always worked. Some women wrote back to say thank you. Others sent their own stories, small victories and large defeats, moments of courage and moments of collapse. A network grew from those letters. Women scattered across the territory who'd never met, but who knew each other through shared experience. Margaret hadn't meant to build it, but there it was. Another kind of cooperative built on the understanding that none of them had to fight alone. Winter came again, but gentler this time. The cooperative families were better prepared with shared supplies and plans for helping each other through the hard months. Silver Creek Ranch weathered the cold with minimal losses, the cattle healthy and the bank account stable enough to sleep through the worst of it. On Clara's 14th birthday in January, Margaret taught her to make the orange cream layer cake that had started everything. "Why this cake?" Clara asked, measuring flour with the precision Margaret had drilled into her. "Because it's the one that told Eleanor Whitmore she didn't get to decide what I was worth, and because you should know how to make something that matters." They worked side by side in the warm kitchen, Clara's hands sure and steady as she separated eggs and creamed butter. She had her father's height now, already taller than most women, and she carried it without shame or apology. "Do you think I'll always be different?" Clara asked as they assembled the layers. "Always too something or not enough something else?" Margaret paused in spreading the orange cream. "Probably. The world has pretty narrow ideas about what women should be. You're going to exceed those ideas in some ways and fall short in others, and people will have opinions about both. Does it get easier? No. But you get stronger, and you learn that other people's opinions are just noise. What matters is what you think of yourself." "And what do you think of yourself, Mama?" The question caught Margaret off guard. What did she think of herself? She was 34 now, settled in a life she'd never imagined having. Wife, mother, rancher, organizer of a cooperative that was changing how small operations survived in hostile territory. She was still too big, still too plain, still too much of everything the world said women shouldn't be. But she was also happy. Genuinely, surprisingly happy in a way she'd long since stopped expecting. "I think I'm enough," Margaret said quietly. "For the first time in my life, I think I'm exactly enough." Clara threw her arms around her waist, getting flour on both of them. "You're more than enough. You're everything." They finished the cake together, 7 perfect layers held together by cream that Margaret had spent years perfecting. When Lucas came in from the barn and saw it, he laughed with pure delight. "You're going to enter the competition again this year," he said. It wasn't a question. "No." "Why not? You'd win again." "Because I don't need to win again. I already proved what I needed to prove." "To Eleanor?" "To myself." They ate the cake after supper, the 3 of them plus Sam and Tommy and the other hands who'd become family through the simple act of staying. It was too rich and too sweet and absolutely perfect. Spring brought new challenges. 2 families wanted to join the cooperative, but they were from outside the immediate area, nearly 40 miles away. Some members worried about expanding too far, too fast. Others saw it as the natural evolution of what they'd built. The debate grew heated at the April meeting. Margaret listened to both sides, understanding the fear and the ambition that drove each argument. "What do you think, Margaret?" someone finally asked. She stood slowly, aware that whatever she said would carry weight she hadn't asked for and didn't entirely want. "I think we built this cooperative because we were tired of being controlled by people who didn't have our interests at heart," she said. "And I think the moment we start deciding who's worthy of joining and who isn't, we become the thing we were fighting against. But we have limited resources. We have limited resources that grow when we pool them. 2 more families means 2 more sources of labor, 2 more sets of skills, 2 more voices in the decisions we make. Yes, it's harder to coordinate across 40 miles, but plenty of things worth doing are hard." The vote was close, but the 2 families were accepted. Margaret hoped it was the right decision. She wouldn't know for months, maybe years. That summer, a letter arrived from Eleanor Whitmore. Margaret almost threw it away unread, but Lucas convinced her to open it. The handwriting was crisp, the words carefully chosen. "Mrs. Bennett, I am writing to inform you that I will not be returning to Dry Ridge. Denver suits me better. The society here is more refined, the opportunities more aligned with my capabilities. I have no interest in rehashing our conflicts or offering explanations you would not accept. But I will say this. You forced me to confront the limits of my influence, and that is a gift I did not want but perhaps needed. I wish you no particular ill will. I also wish you no particular success. We are simply women who wanted different things and fought for them with the tools available to us. You won. I accept that. Do not expect me to admire you for it. Eleanor Whitmore. Margaret read the letter twice, trying to find the trap, the hidden threat. But there was none. Just a woman who'd lost admitting defeat without quite calling it that. What will you do? Lucas asked. Nothing. There's nothing to do. She's gone, we're here, and that's the end of it. She burned the letter in the kitchen stove, watching Eleanor's words turn to ash the same way she'd watched the Denver offer burn years before. Some things were better consigned to smoke and memory. Clara graduated from school that spring, top of her small class. The teacher, a new one, Eleanor's replacement, praised her intelligence and work ethic. Several families from town attended the small ceremony, people who'd slowly come around to accepting that the Bennett family wasn't going anywhere and might even be worth knowing. What will you do now, the teacher asked Clara. Help run the ranch. Maybe study veterinary medicine through correspondence courses. Build something that lasts. No thoughts of going east? Seeing the wider world? Clara smiled, and Margaret saw herself in that smile, the quiet certainty of someone who knew exactly what she wanted. This is my world, Clara said, and it's plenty wide enough. The cooperative's third anniversary that fall was marked with a harvest celebration at Silver Creek Ranch. Families came from across the territory, bringing food and music, and children who ran wild through the barn while their parents discussed prices and planning. Margaret stood at the edge of the gathering, watching people who'd been strangers 3 years ago treat each other like family. Not perfect family. There were still arguments and grudges and philosophical differences, but family nonetheless. You did this, Lucas said, coming to stand beside her. We did this. No, Margaret, you did this. You showed people it was possible, and you held the center when everything tried to tear it apart. She leaned against him, solid and warm and hers. I just refuse to quit. That's all courage really is. Refusing to quit when quitting makes sense. Is that what we've been? Courageous? I think we've been desperate and stubborn and occasionally stupid, but yeah, we've been courageous too. Clara found them as the sun set, her face flushed from dancing. Sam says the Pratts are going to buy the old Morrison place. Says with the cooperative's backing, they can actually make it work. That's good news. It means the cooperative's growing, that we're making a real difference. She paused, looking between them. This is what winning looks like, isn't it? Not beating one person, but building something that outlasts the fight. Margaret pulled her close, Lucas's arm around both of them. Yes, sweetheart. This is what winning looks like. They stood together as the celebration continued around them. 3 people who'd been broken in different ways and who'd somehow built a life from the pieces. The journalist, Catherine Mills, came back the following spring to do a follow-up article. The cooperative had grown to 32 families now, with 2 more wanting to join. The territory was taking notice, both admirers and critics watching to see if this experiment in collective action could sustain itself. Do you ever worry about failure? Catherine asked during the interview. Every day, Margaret answered honestly. But I worried about failure when I was trying to disappear too, and that was worse because I was failing at being someone I wasn't. At least now I'm failing as myself. But you're not failing. Not today. But tomorrow might be different. Success isn't a destination, Miss Mills. It's a choice you make every morning, to show up, do the work, and deal with whatever comes. And love? You never speak about your marriage in romantic terms. Is that intentional? Margaret considered the question carefully. My marriage to Lucas wasn't a love match. It was a strategic alliance that became something else through time and work and shared battles. Romance is for people with easier lives. We built partnership instead, which is more valuable when the world's trying to grind you down. Do you love him now? I love what we've built together. I love that he sees me as capable instead of convenient. I love that he never asked me to be smaller to make him feel bigger. If that's not romance, it's something better. Catherine wrote that down, smiling. I think that might be the most honest description of marriage I've ever heard. The article ran in June, and again letters flooded in. But this time they weren't just from women. Men wrote too, farmers and ranchers who wanted to know how to start their own cooperatives, who were tired of being squeezed by larger operations, and who saw in the High Plains model a path to survival. Margaret wasn't sure what to do with the attention. She wasn't a natural leader, wasn't comfortable being held up as an example. But Sam pointed out that she didn't have to be comfortable, just useful. People need proof that fighting back works, he said. You're that proof. Doesn't matter if you like it. So Margaret started traveling. Not far, not often, but enough. She visited struggling farms and shared what she'd learned. She helped other communities organize their own cooperatives, adapting the model to local needs. She spoke at meetings and gatherings, always uncomfortable, always certain she wasn't the right person for this, but doing it anyway because someone had to and no one else was stepping forward. Clara accompanied her on some trips, learning the work of organizing and persuasion. The girl had her real mother's, gift for reading people, combined with Margaret's refusal to accept defeat. It was a powerful combination. Do you think I'll be able to do what you've done? Clara asked during one trip back from a neighboring county where they'd helped establish a new cooperative chapter. You'll do more. You're starting with advantages I never had: education, confidence, a family that supports you. You won't have to waste years figuring out that you're allowed to exist. But what if I fail? Then you fail. And then you get up and try something else. Failure's not the enemy, Clara. Giving up is. 5 years after Margaret first arrived in Dry Ridge, the town held another baking competition. Margaret didn't enter. She had nothing left to prove to these people, and Clara was adamant that her mother had better things to do than bake for the approval of women who'd spent years trying to drive her away. But the competition itself had changed. Women from cooperative families participated now, and their entries reflected the confidence that came from knowing they didn't need Dry Ridge's approval to know their worth. The competition was less about social hierarchy and more about actual skill. Eleanor's replacement as the town's social arbiter, a banker's wife who was ambitious but not cruel, approached Margaret at church the Sunday after the competition. I wanted to thank you, she said. For what? For showing us we could be more than what Eleanor decided we should be. I spent 10 years following her rules, terrified of stepping wrong. Watching you refuse to play that game freed the rest of us. Margaret didn't know what to say to that. She'd never meant to free anyone. She'd just been trying to survive. You're welcome, she said finally, because it seemed like the response the woman needed. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Lucas gave Margaret a gift she didn't expect. Not jewelry or fabric or any of the traditional offerings. He gave her a deed. What's this? She asked, unfolding the paper. The ranch. In your name. Joint ownership. Legal and binding. Margaret stared at the document, her hands shaking slightly. Lucas, you've earned it. More than earned it. This place exists because you refuse to let it die. It's as much yours as mine, and the paperwork should reflect that. She looked up at him, this man who'd offered her a practical arrangement and who'd given her a life instead. You trust me with this. I trust you with everything. You've proven I can. That night, Margaret lay awake thinking about the journey from cook to co-owner, from woman trying to disappear to woman who couldn't be ignored. It hadn't been easy. Most of it had been brutal. But she'd survived every attempt to break her, and she'd built something in the process. Something real, something lasting. Clara was 16 now, strong and capable and entirely her own person. She worked the ranch with the same fierce determination Margaret had brought to the kitchen years ago. She also studied through correspondence courses, devouring books on agriculture, animal husbandry, business management. The girl had plans, big ones, and Margaret had no doubt she'd achieve them. I want to expand the cooperative, Clara announced one evening at dinner. Not just buying and selling, but education. Teaching people better techniques, bringing in experts, creating a knowledge base we can all draw from. That takes money, Lucas said. So we fundraise. We show people what we've accomplished and ask them to invest in what we could accomplish. Mama's proved people will support ideas that make sense. Margaret felt that particular blend of pride and terror that came from watching your child dream bigger than you dared. You'll need to convince the cooperative members first. I know, that's why I'm practicing on you two. She had Lucas convinced within 20 minutes. Margaret held out longer, not because she didn't believe in the idea, but because she wanted Clara to sharpen her arguments, learn to defend her vision against skepticism. The girl passed the test with honors. The cooperative voted to support Clara's educational initiative at the spring meeting. She started small, bringing in a veterinarian to teach basic animal care, organizing workshops on soil conservation, establishing a lending library of agricultural texts. But it grew. As most things Clara touched seemed to grow, fed by her enthusiasm and the collective hunger for knowledge that came from people who'd been denied it too long. By the time Clara was 18, she was running the educational program full-time, while Margaret focused on expanding the cooperative's reach and Lucas managed the ranch operations. They'd become a team, each playing to their strengths, covering each other's weaknesses. The ranch prospered, the cooperative thrived. And Margaret Bennett, who'd arrived in Dry Ridge as a cook with nothing but a carpet bag and stubborn refusal to quit, became something she'd never imagined. She became a woman who'd changed a corner of the world simply by refusing to let it change her. On the 20th anniversary of her arrival in Dry Ridge, the cooperative held a celebration in her honor. Margaret tried to refuse, uncomfortable with the attention, but Clara and Lucas overruled her. "You don't get to hide from this," Clara said. "You changed all our lives. Let us say thank you. Thank." So Margaret stood in the barn that had hosted so many meetings and battles, surrounded by families who'd become community, and listened to people talk about what her stubbornness had made possible. Sarah Pratt spoke about keeping her farm. Sam talked about finding a place where his skills mattered more than his past. Tommy, now married with 2 children, mentioned that his damaged hand had never stopped him from building a good life because the Bennetts had never let it define him. And Clara, fierce and beautiful and entirely her own person, stood up and said, "My mother taught me that worth is built, not granted, that taking up space isn't a sin, that the only opinion that really matters is your own. Everything I am, everything I've built, stands on that foundation. So thank you, Mama, for refusing to shrink, for showing me I don't have to either." Margaret cried, which she hated doing in public, but she couldn't help it. These people, this life, this improbable family she'd built from scraps and determination, it was more than she'd ever let herself want. Lucas pulled her close when the speeches ended, held her while she collected herself. "You all right?" he asked quietly. "I'm better than all right. I'm happy. Actually, genuinely happy." "You sound surprised." "I am. I spent so long thinking happiness wasn't for people like me that I forgot to notice when it showed up anyway." They stood together in the barn doorway, watching the celebration continue around them. The cooperative had grown to 48 families now, spread across 3 counties. Clara's educational program served hundreds of people. The ranch was profitable and stable, protected by the community they'd helped build. Margaret thought about Eleanor Whitmore sometimes, wondered if she'd found whatever she was looking for in Denver. Probably not. People like Eleanor never found satisfaction because they measured their worth by other people's submission. It was a calculation that could never balance. But Margaret had learned a different math. She'd learned that worth came from showing up, from doing the work, from refusing to quit when quitting made sense. She'd learned that family was what you chose, that love was built through shared battles, that belonging didn't require permission from people who'd never wanted you there. She'd learned that you didn't have to be perfect to matter. You just had to be willing to keep fighting. "What are you thinking?" Lucas asked. "That we did it. Against every odd, despite every obstacle, we actually did it. Built a good life? Built a life at all. A real one, where we get to be ourselves without apology. Was it worth it? All the fighting and fear and years of struggle?" Margaret looked at Clara laughing with friends she'd grown up alongside, looked at the community gathered in their barn, strong because they'd learned to support each other, looked at Lucas, her partner in every sense that mattered. "Every second," she said. "Every single second." The sun set over Silver Creek Ranch, painting the prairie in colors that would fade into darkness and rise again tomorrow. The same cycle, day after day, season after season. But the land beneath that cycle belonged to them now, not through Eleanor's permission or the town's approval, but through the simple act of refusing to leave when everyone wanted them gone. Margaret had arrived in Dry Ridge as a woman the world had told didn't fit. She'd leave it, someday, years from now, as a woman who'd proven that fitting was optional, that worth was self-determined, that the only size that mattered was how big you were willing to dream and how hard you were willing to fight for those dreams. She'd arrived as a cook. She'd become a force. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.